The night Imani Bellrose's phone rang at 11:15 p.m., she was on her knees, scrubbing someone else's floor. That's the part nobody talks about when they tell this story later. Not the warehouse by the docks. Not the man with the cold eyes who ran half of Seattle's criminal underworld. Not the ledger that could have gotten her killed 6 different ways before sunrise. They start with the dramatic part. But the truth is, it started with Imani on her knees, smelling like pine cleaner and exhaustion, wearing a gray uniform 2 sizes too big because the housekeeping agency bought uniforms, assuming the women inside them were small. Imani was not small. She had never been small, and for 33 years the world had made absolutely certain she knew exactly what it thought about that. Her phone buzzed against the marble tile. She almost didn't answer. The Bellrose rule, her grandmother's rule, the one Loretta had repeated so many times it was practically stitched into Imani's chest, was that you finished what you started before you stopped for anything else. You didn't half clean a floor. You didn't half live a life. But the number was the care facility's main line. And care facilities didn't call at 11:15 p. With good news, Imani sat back on her heels and answered. She listened for 40 seconds. Then she pressed her back against the hallway wall, pulled her knees to her chest the way she used to do as a little girl in her grandmother's kitchen during thunderstorms, and tried very hard not to make any noise while she fell apart. She almost made it. If you've never worked a job where you are expected to be invisible, it's hard to explain what 18 months of practiced invisibility does to a person. You learn to move differently, quieter footsteps, eyes that slide past people instead of landing on them, a posture that says, I am part of the furniture. Please don't look directly at me. You get good at reading rooms without appearing to read them. You know which hallways to avoid after certain cars arrive in the driveway. You know which doors never open and which ones always do, and what each sound inside a house means about the mood of the man who owns it. Imani had learned all of this about Kang Tae-jun's waterfront residence in the first 3 weeks. She had learned it the way all women in her position learned it, not because anyone taught her, but because getting it wrong had consequences, and Imani had already run out of room in her life for more consequences. The residence was a 5-story architectural statement at the edge of Lake Washington, the kind of building that looked like someone had taken a glass and steel office tower and convinced it to lie down horizontally along the water. Tae-jun didn't call it a house. His people called it the property. Imani, in the privacy of her own head, called it the fishbowl, all those windows, all that glass, and somehow the man at the center of it managed to remain completely opaque. She'd seen him maybe a dozen times in 18 months. Never up close. Always at a distance, at the far end of a corridor, descending a staircase as she rounded a corner and flattened herself against the wall. Visible through a window, she was cleaning from the outside while he sat on the other side of the glass, not looking at anything she could identify. He was not what she'd expected the first time. She'd built up a picture in her head from fragments, from the tension in his household staff, from the cars that arrived after midnight, a sound like green wood splitting from the way certain men walked through the front door with the careful body language of people who were never entirely sure they'd be allowed to walk back out. She'd expected loud, showy, the kind of dangerous that announced itself. Kang Tae-jun was none of those things. He was 41, lean in the way that suggested a body kept deliberately under control rather than naturally built, with a face that gave away exactly as much as he chose and nothing else. He dressed plainly for a man of his resources, dark clothes, no jewelry except a single watch she'd once gotten close enough to notice. Nothing that said, look at me. Everything about him said the opposite. Don't look at me. Don't think about me. Don't remember you saw me. Imani understood that impulse more than she wanted to. The one rule she'd been given on her first night, given by the household manager, a tight-mouthed Korean woman named Mrs. O, who communicated primarily through meaningful silences, was deceptively simple. Never stop outside his office door. If you're carrying something, keep walking. If you need to clean that hallway, do it when the office is empty. If you find yourself standing outside that door for any reason, you had better already be moving in a direction that takes you away from it. Imani had never broken that rule, until the night the care facility called. The call lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. She knew because she stared at the timer on her phone screen while the nurse on the other end explained what had happened, what Loretta would need going forward, and what it would cost. Loretta, like Green, 8 years old, the woman who had raised Imani from age 7 after Imani's mother died of a stroke in the kitchen of their apartment in Rainier Valley, had wandered out of the care facility at approximately 9:40 p.m. wearing a nightgown and one slipper. One slipper. The image of it hit Imani somewhere below her sternum and stayed there, a dull, persistent ache that didn't feel like what she'd always imagined grief would feel like. It felt smaller than that, more specific. One slipper. Her grandmother, who had worked 31 years as a school cafeteria supervisor and never once left the house without her shoes properly tied, wandering into the snow in one slipper, because the part of her brain that used to track those details had quietly stopped working sometime in the past year. They'd found Loretta 3 blocks away, sitting on the curb in front of a closed dry cleaning shop, having what appeared to be a calm conversation with someone who wasn't there. She was physically unharmed. She needed a secured memory care unit now. Not recommended, required. The open residential wing where she'd been living was no longer sufficient. The cost difference was $1,100 per month. Ms. Bellrose? The nurse's voice was not unkind. Are you still there? Yes, Imani said. I'm here. She calculated it in her head the way she'd been calculating financial problems since she was 9 years old, and realized that knowing the numbers exactly was better than not knowing, even when the numbers were bad. She made $19.40 an hour. After taxes, after the bus pass, after the small amount she sent every month to the cousin in Tacoma who had taken in Loretta's cat, when the facility said no animals she had, on a good month, about $200 left over. She'd been putting it toward the next month's care bill, which had already stretched her to the edge. $1,100. Not a gap she could close. Not a bridge she could build with what she had. An actual cliff edge, the kind that didn't negotiate. We can give you until the end of next week, the nurse said. After that, we'll need to discuss alternative placements. Alternative placements. The phrase landed with a weight the nurse probably didn't intend. Imani knew what alternative placements meant. She'd spent 3 months 2 years ago calling every alternative placement in the Seattle metro area when Loretta's savings first ran out, when Imani's own savings were already gone, when the job that was supposed to carry them both had collapsed around her like a building whose frame had been secretly rotting for years. She knew exactly what kind of rooms alternative placements had, what kind of staffing ratios, what kind of smell, what it looked like when a woman who had worked 31 years and raised someone else's child and kept an entire family upright through sheer force of character ended up in a room like that. Thank you, Imani said. I'll call you tomorrow. She hung up, and then she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She let herself cry, not loud. She had too much practice at quiet for it to be loud. It was the kind of crying that barely moved her face, just tears that came, because there was nowhere else for the pressure to go, and her hands pressed flat against the cold marble floor because she needed to feel something solid. And her shoulders shook once, twice, and then she pressed her teeth together, hard, and breathed through it. She was still breathing through it when the door opened. Later, when she tried to reconstruct exactly what happened in those first few seconds, she couldn't do it cleanly. Memory doesn't preserve shock well. What she remembered was light from inside the office spilling into the hallway, and the particular quality of silence that falls when someone who didn't expect to find you suddenly does. She had time to register that she was sitting on the floor outside his door before she registered that he was standing in the doorway, looking at her. Kang Tae-jun, 3 feet away. Imani's first instinct was humiliation. Pure, immediate, animal humiliation, the kind that comes from being caught in a private moment by someone with power over your circumstances. She started to get up, and her knee slipped on the wet marble where her mop bucket had tipped slightly, and she grabbed the wall to catch herself and still didn't quite manage to come up gracefully. She said, "I'm sorry, I'll move." That was it. That was her whole plan. Move. Get gone. Don't make this into anything it didn't have to be. Tae-jun said, "How much?" Imani stopped. I'm sorry? The difference. His English was precise, accented but comfortable, the English of someone who had learned it as a working language, not a performance. You said 1100. How much do you have now? She stared at him. You heard that. My office door is not as thick as it appears. The thing was, and this was the part that got under her skin later, when she had time to examine it, he didn't say it like it was an apology. He didn't say it like he'd been deliberately eavesdropping. He said it the way someone states a logistical fact. Here is the situation. Here are the numbers. What are we working with? It was, she realized, exactly how she talked about problems she was trying to solve. That's a private conversation, Imani said. Yes. You shouldn't have heard it. I agree. He didn't move from the doorway. How much do you have? That's not your business. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not softening exactly. More like recalibration. Like he'd expected a particular kind of answers and gotten a different one. You're sitting on the floor outside my office. At 11:15 at night crying, he said. You have approximately 9 days to find money you don't have before your grandmother loses her room. I heard the number. I'm asking what else you have, so I understand the actual gap. Why? Because I'm going to cover it. The word sat in the air between them. Imani took a breath, let it out slowly. No, she said. He let the silence run for a few seconds. Then you're refusing. That's what no means, yes. You understand what I'm offering. I understand exactly what you're offering. Imani picked up her mop, not because she intended to mop anything, but because having something in her hands made her feel less like she was standing on open water. I've worked in this house for 18 months. I know what happens when people take things from you. His expression shifted again. Something that might have been in a less controlled face. Surprise. What happens? He asked. They owe you. That's an accurate observation. So no, Imani said, thank you. I'll figure it out. She meant to walk away after that. She had the direction already in her body down the corridor, left, surf stairs out. Scene. She'd gotten about 4 steps when he spoke again, and something in his voice was different enough that her feet stopped before she'd made any conscious decision to stop them. My sister's name was Kang Tae-jun. Imani turned slowly. He was still standing in the doorway, one hand against the frame. Not a relaxed posture, deliberate. She died 4 years ago, he said. She left behind a daughter, 14 years old. Her name is Yuna. Imani didn't say anything. I tell you this, Tae-jun said, because I want you to understand that I am aware there are things that matter more than pride or caution or the balance of what is owed. Sometimes the person who needs protecting cannot protect themselves. Sometimes accepting help is not the same as surrendering to the person offering it. The silence stretched. Imani said, that's a very careful thing to say. I am a very careful man. Then you know that careful people don't take things from other careful people without knowing why they're being offered. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway. Come in, he said. I'll make tea. You can tell me about your grandmother, and I'll tell you what I actually want from you, and then you can decide. It was, she thought, the most honest sentence anyone in this house had ever said to her, which was either a very good sign or a very bad one. She went in. The office was not what she'd spent 18 months imagining. She'd mopped the hallway outside it 40, 50 times. She'd cataloged every sound she'd been able to identify through the door, the low register of voices in Korean she didn't speak, the occasional movement of furniture, the specific quality of silence that meant he was working alone versus the different quality of silence that meant he was reading versus the kind that meant something had happened, and she should finish her work on that floor quickly and move on. She'd built an entire architecture in her head of what was on the other side. It was smaller than she expected, warmer, not cold corporate glass and steel. The desk was wood, real wood, old and solid, the kind of piece that belonged to a different era and had ended up here. There were books, actual books, not decorative ones, she could tell, by the way the spines were broken in, by the papers sticking out between pages as markers. A side table near the window with what appeared to be a half-finished model of a traditional Korean ship, small wooden pieces arranged in progress. And photographs. Not many, but on the corner of the desk, facing inward so they were visible only to the person sitting behind it, 2 photographs in plain frames. A woman who looked enough like Tae-jun that the relationship was obvious, his sister, and a teenage girl laughing at something off camera, completely unguarded. Yuna. Imani sat in the chair across from the desk while he made tea with the quiet efficiency of someone doing a thing they'd done so many times it no longer required thought. He set the cup in front of her and sat down across from her and said, "Your name before the accounting firm was Imani Bellrose. Before the housekeeping agency, you worked for a medical billing company called Hargrove Health Management. You were their lead reconciliation specialist for 4 years. In March of 2 years ago, approximately $180,000 disappeared from a patient assistance fund over a period of 8 months. An internal audit identified 3 employees with access to the fund. You were one of them." Imani's hands went still around the teacup. "The investigation cleared you," Tae-jun continued. "Another employee, a man named Warren Fitch, eventually confessed and agreed to restitution as part of a plea. You were issued a formal letter of clearance." He paused. "The letter did nothing to help you find another job in your field." The quiet in the room was very different now. "How long have you known this?" Imani said. "Since your 3rd week here." 3 weeks. She'd worked under his roof for 18 months thinking she was invisible. She'd been visible since week 3. "Why?" she said. He folded his hands on the desk. "Because I needed to know who was inside my home." A pause. "And because several months ago, I began to realize I needed someone with your specific skills. I was waiting for the right time to ask, and tonight is the right time." "Tonight," he said, the situation selected itself. She set the teacup down very carefully. Then she looked at him directly, the first time she'd looked directly at him from less than 10 feet away in 18 months. "You knew about Hargrove," she said. "You knew I was cleared." "Yes, and you hired me anyway." "I hired you because—" "A woman who was accused of stealing and didn't steal, who was cleared but still lost everything, who is now cleaning floors to keep her grandmother in a care home, that is not a woman I need to worry about stealing from me." Something in his expression didn't quite qualify as a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "It's also not a woman who is going to talk." She sat with that for a moment. "What do you want?" she said. "Actually want. Say it plainly." "Someone is stealing from me," Tae-jun said. "My accountant. Park Min-sik. He has worked with my organization for 6 years. He is very skilled at making numbers say things they don't mean. I need someone more skilled. I audit legitimate business records only. That is all I'm asking for. I won't touch anything that isn't clean." "Agreed." She looked at him for a long time. He held still and let her look. "The $1,100, she finally said. "That's not payment for the work." "No, it's separate." "Consider it a correction," he said. "Something that should not have been allowed to become your problem." "That's a strange way to put it." "It's an accurate one." He met her eyes. "The woman who raised you well enough that she's still the reason you're in this room instead of having taken the money and left. I'm aware of what that means. I'm not asking you to be someone you aren't." Imani breathed. Outside, through the large windows that faced the lake, snow was beginning to fall again, the fine, dry kind that caught the light and turned the air silver. "I want it in writing," she said. "Loretta's room is covered for as long as she needs it. That doesn't change based on what I find or what happens after. Independent arrangement through a third party. I'll have the documents by tomorrow evening. And when this is finished, I walk clean. You write me a professional reference that reflects 18 months of exemplary housekeeping performance and nothing else. No indication of any other arrangement. I disappear back into the world I came from." Agreed. "If at any point I believe this has crossed from legitimate accounting into anything else, I stop." "Understood." Imani picked up the tea, drank, set it down. "Then tell me what you know so far," she said. "About Minsu. About the money. Don't tell me about the other parts of your business. Just tell me the numbers and where they don't make sense." Tae-jun reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a folder. He opened it toward her, and they began. She did not go home that night. She stayed in the office until 4 a.m. Working through up the initial documents, he gave her legitimate company records for the shipping business, the 3 restaurants, the 2 laundromats, the parking facility. On the surface, they were competent, clean books. Min-sik was good. Clearly good. The kind of accountant who understood that the best theft was the kind that looked, at a glance, like it wasn't happening. But Imani had spent 4 years at Hargrove Health Management, finding exactly this kind of thing. She found the first anomaly in the shipping records at 218A. A vendor called Pacific Rim Freight Solutions, LLC, appearing 18 months ago, paid quarterly. Nothing obviously wrong, except that the payment amounts varied in a pattern that didn't match any legitimate shipping volume fluctuation she could construct. She circled it, said nothing, wrote it in her own notation on the notepad she'd brought from her cleaning cart, using a personal shorthand nobody else would be able to read. Tae-jun sat across the desk, reading his own documents, and didn't ask what she'd found. He understood, apparently, that she would tell him when she was ready. By the time she left at 4 a.m., she had 4 anomalies marked and a map beginning to form in her head. She took the bus home in the blue dark of early morning, sitting in the back where she always sat, watching the city slide past the windows. The snow had stopped. The streets were quiet. Somewhere across town, in a room that now had a few more days of security attached to it, her grandmother was sleeping. Imani pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and let herself feel, for just a moment, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been holding everything up for so long that she's genuinely forgotten what it felt like to put any of it down. Then the bus lurched around a corner, and she straightened, and she took out her notepad, and she kept working. A sound like Gree already talking to her. The numbers were figure out what they were saying and who they were saying it to. The second anomaly appeared on a Thursday. Imani had been at it for 11 days by then, 11 days of double life, which was the only way she could think of it, because there was no other phrase that fit. Days, gray uniform, mop bucket, the specific quiet of a woman who has learned to take up as little space as possible. Nights, the office, the ledgers, the slow and methodical excavation of numbers that had been arranged to lie. She'd found her rhythm. Clock out at midnight. Wait 20 minutes in the service hallway until misses. Oh, finished her final walkthrough, then back up the east staircase. She knew which steps creaked and which didn't. 18 months of knowledge, finally useful for something other than not getting noticed to the 3rd floor, to the office, where Tae-jun was almost always already there. They didn't talk much, those first 11 days. That surprised her. She'd expected more questions, more pressure, more of the particular kind of attention that men in his position tended to use like a tool. Instead, he worked at his desk, and she worked at the side table he'd cleared for her, and they shared the same silence, the way 2 people share a room on a long train journey, present, aware of each other, not intruding. He brought tea at roughly 1 a.m. every night, without asking if she wanted it. She drank it every night without thanking him, because they had some unspoken agreement that small gratitudes would make things complicated, and neither of them wanted complicated. She had found the first vendor anomaly on night 1. Pacific Rim Freight Solutions, LLC payments that didn't match volume, a company that had materialized from nothing 18 months ago and seemed to exist primarily on paper. Night 6, she'd found a second shell, Cascade Insurance Brokers, which was paying out claims on Tae-jun's restaurant properties at a frequency that made no actuarial sense, unless the restaurants were burning down twice a year, which they weren't. Night 11, the laundromats. She almost missed it. It was buried in the quarterly reconciliation for the smallest location, a coin laundry in the Beacon Hill neighborhood that generated modest but consistent revenue. Nothing flashy, nothing that would draw an eye, unless you were looking at the payroll structure and noticed that 3 employees were being paid for 40 hours a week at a location that the operational logs showed was only staffed for 26. Ghost employees, 14 hours a week, 3 bodies, 8 weeks of records available to her. She did the math in her head before she wrote it down. Came up with a number, wrote it down anyway, because she needed to see it. It was small. Compared to the vendor manipulation, it was almost insultingly small. But that was the thing about Minsik's method. She was beginning to understand how he thought, and the way he thought was layers. No single entry that constituted a smoking gun. Instead, a dozen small bleeds spread across a dozen different business structures, none of them individually alarming, all of them pointing the same direction when you stood back and looked at the whole map. She looked at the whole map. She sat back in her chair and pressed her palms flat on the table and stared at what she'd assembled. The money wasn't just disappearing, it was being organized. Quarterly, consistent amounts that didn't spike or dip consistent enough that someone had set up a schedule and was maintaining it deliberately. The kind of discipline that required either extreme confidence or extreme protection. She looked at Tae-jun across the desk. He was reading a document in Korean, one hand flat on the desk, and he had that particular stillness she'd come to recognize as his version of concentration, everything in him gathered and pointed inward, like a man who has learned to keep all of his intensity inside his own skin. Min-suk, she said, how long has he worked for you? Tae-jun looked up. 6 years, and before you. He came recommended through a contact in Los Angeles. Korean-American business community. Well regarded. Did you verify the recommendation? A pause. Just a breath's worth, but she caught it. Not personally. My previous financial director handled the hire. Where is your previous financial director now? Something moved behind his eyes. He retired. 3 years ago. Imani tapped her pen against the notepad. How convenient. What have you found? She told him about the laundromats. Walked him through the ghost payroll structure, the vendor anomalies she'd already documented, the insurance pattern. She didn't dramatize it. She laid it out the way she'd been trained to lay out audit findings sequential, evidenced, here is what I see, and here is what it means. When she finished, the silence in the room had a different texture than the comfortable silence of the past 11 nights. The total across what I've confirmed so far, she said, is somewhere between $14,000 and $18,000 per month. I say somewhere because I don't have access to all of the records yet. What I'm seeing is the outer edge of something. There's a center to this that I haven't reached. Find the center, Tae-jun said. I'm working on it. She paused. I need the holding company records. The ones for the properties, not the operations. Mrs. O told me, on my first week, that certain files are kept in the basement archive. I need access. I'll have them moved to this office by tomorrow night. I also need Min-suk's personnel file, not to confront him. I just want to see what he put on paper about himself before I start comparing it to what the numbers are telling me. Tae-jun opened the desk drawer, pulled out a thin folder, and placed it on the edge of the desk toward her. She stared at it. You already had it ready, she said. I had it ready the day I asked you to do this work. Why didn't you give it to me earlier? Because I wanted to see what you found without it first. A pause. Confirmation bias is a liability. I needed your eyes on the numbers before your eyes were on him. Imani picked up the folder, opened it. Park Min-suk. 44 years old. Born in Busan, immigrated at age 19. Bachelor's degree in accounting from the University of Washington. A list of prior employment that looked impeccable, a CPA firm in Bellevue, a brief stint with a mid-sized shipping company, then 6 years with Tae-jun's organization. She read it twice, then she set it down. His degree, she said. UW class listed as 2003. Is there a copy of the actual diploma on file? No. Has anyone ever verified it? The brief pause again. I assume the previous director did. You assume. She looked up. For 6 years, you've had a man with full access to your financial records, and you assumed someone else verified his credentials. Tae-jun's jaw tightened, just slightly. She filed that away. That was what anger looked like on him. Small and controlled and, she suspected, not something many people got to see. Verify it, he said. I intend to. She closed the folder. But I want to be clear about something. I find what I think I'm going to find in the holding company records. The conversations we need to have after that is going to be uncomfortable. Because the amount of money I'm projecting and the structure of how it's moving, that's not one person being greedy. That's one person working for someone else. Tae-jun didn't answer. He didn't need to. The stillness that settled over him told her he'd already suspected it. She went back to the ledger. He went back to his document. The snow fell outside. The holding company records arrived the following evening in 3 bankers' boxes. Imani had brought a second notepad. She was going to need it. She started at 12:30 a.m. and didn't stop until nearly 5. What she found in those 3 boxes systematically dismantled every remaining illusion that this was a manageable internal problem. The holding companies, 4 of them, layered, each one nominally owning pieces of the others in a structure designed to obscure beneficial ownership, had been bleeding money through a specific channel for 11 months. Quarterly payments, routed first to a company called Cascades Pacific Holdings, then to a second entity called Honol Investment Group, then to a third that didn't seem to have a name she could locate in any of the documentation available to her. The amount's $40,000 per quarter, per holding company. 4 holding companies. 11 months. She did the arithmetic 4 times because she didn't trust herself the first 3. $1,760,000. Roughly. Over 11 months. Flowing somewhere she couldn't see from inside the records available to her. She set the pen down, picked it up again, set it down. She thought about what Tae-jun had told her, that first night over tea, about Baek Do-hwan, about Seo-rin, about Yuna, about a man who had been trying to force an alliance for years and kept getting refused. She thought about required to build a financial extraction structure that had been running cleanly for 11 months without detection. She thought about the name Honol Investment Group, which she had never encountered before, but which was now sitting in front of her like a word in a language she was just beginning to understand. She didn't tell Tae-jun that night. She needed to be sure first. A sound like greenwood splitting. She took careful photographs of the relevant pages with her phone, not because she planned to share them, but because she understood at some level she didn't examine too closely that documents had a way of disappearing when the information inside them became inconvenient. Then she went home. The verification of Min-sik's degree took 48 hours, and a carefully worded inquiry submitted through a professional contact Imani still had at a legitimate CPA firm in Bellevue, a woman named Deborah Oseyes, who had mentored her briefly after the Hargrove collapse and was one of maybe 4 people in the professional world who didn't treat Imani like a liability. The response came back on a Saturday afternoon while Imani was visiting Loretta. The new room was good. South-facing windows, which mattered because Loretta had always been a person who needed light. The staff knew her name. There was a small table by the window where Loretta kept a photograph of Imani's mother young, laughing, caught mid-gesture at a backyard birthday party sometime in the mid-'80s, and a ceramic mug with a broken handle that Loretta had refused to throw away for 20 years. Because, as she said, a broken handle doesn't mean it can't hold coffee. Loretta was having a clear day. That happened less frequently now, but when it happened, it was like finding something you'd stopped expecting to find sharp and bright and precious, for exactly the reason that it wouldn't last. "You look tired, baby," Loretta said. Her hand, papery and warm, found Imani's across the table. "I'm fine, Grandma. You look like you're carrying something you don't know how to put down." Imani smiled. It didn't reach much, always. "Who's the man?" Imani went still. "What man?" "The one putting that particular look on your face." Loretta's eyes, still sharp on days like this, found hers without effort. "Not a love look. Something else. Like you're trying to figure out if you can trust someone, and you haven't decided yet." Imani looked out the window. Across the facility's small courtyard, a bare-branched tree was doing something complicated with the afternoon light. "He's complicated," she said. "Men worth worrying about usually are." Loretta squeezed her hand. "Don't forget you have a brain, Imani. Whatever this is. Use your brain, I am. Good. Then use your gut, too." Imani's phone buzzed. Deborah's response, she read it once. Then she excused herself and stepped into the hallway and read it again, slowly, because she needed every word to land correctly. The University of Washington had no record of a Park Min-suk graduating from their accounting program in 2003, or in 2002, or in 2004. They had a Park Min-suk enrolled in 2000 who had withdrawn before completing his degree. Withdrawn, not graduated. Imani leaned her back against the facility hallway wall, same posture, different wall than 11 nights ago, and stared at the drop ceiling tiles and thought about 6 years. Six years Min-sik had been operating inside Tae-jun's organization, on the strength of credentials he'd never earned, recommended by a director who was now conveniently retired. A sound like green wood splitting, running a financial extraction operation that had moved over $1.7 million somewhere that connected. She was increasingly certain to the man responsible for a 14-year-old girl growing up without her mother. Her phone screen went dark. She put it in her pocket and went back into Loretta's room and sat with her grandmother for another hour, holding her hand and talking about nothing because Loretta deserved an hour of nothing. And Imani needed to remember what normal felt like before she walked back into whatever came next. She told Tae-jun that night. All of it. The holding company extraction, the quarterly schedule, the total, the shell companies she'd traced as far as she could, the name Hanel Investment Group that appeared twice in the chain before the trail went dark. And then she told him about the degree. She watched his face during the degree part. She was watching for the anger she'd glimpsed 2 nights ago, that controlled, compressed tightening. It wasn't there. What was there was worse. What was there was the face of a man absorbing information that confirmed something he had been hoping was wrong. You knew, she said, not an accusation, just the words. Suspected. His voice was flat. 2 months ago, a contact mentioned Hanel Group in the context of a different conversation. I didn't connect it then. The name didn't surface in the records I could access directly. Because Min-sik controls the records you access directly. Yes. He's been in those files for 6 years. He's built the information architecture of your entire financial operation. He knows exactly what you can see and exactly what you can't. Yes, Tae-jun. She waited until he looked at her directly. $1.7 million. 11 months. That's not opportunistic theft. That's a funded operation. Someone has been paying Min-suk to be inside your organization. Someone has been financing him to build this pipeline. And the only person I can identify with both the motive and the organization to do that. Do-won, he said. The name dropped into the room like something heavy hitting the floor. Neither of them moved. If I'm right, Imani said carefully, and everything I've found points to this, then Do-hwan has had a man inside your financial operation for 6 years. He knows the structure of your legitimate businesses. He knows your cash flow patterns. He's been funding himself with your money and building a picture of your organization that you've never had the chance to audit because the auditor was his. Tae-jun stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her for long enough that she started wondering if he'd simply decided she was no longer in the room. Then he said quietly, "Does Min-sik know you've been looking at his records?" "No. I've been careful, you're certain." "I'm careful by nature," she said. "I've been careful since week 1 in this house. Min-suk has no reason to look at me. I'm the housekeeper." Another silence. Outside, the lake was black and smooth, under a sky that had cleared for the first time in weeks, stars visible for the first time since she'd started this work. "The Hanel chain," Tae-jun said, still facing the window. "You said it went dark. How far can you trace it?" 2 entities past Cascade Pacific. After that, the ownership structure is buried deep enough that I'd need access to financial records outside this house. She paused. "But I know people." He turned. "What kind of people?" "The legitimate kind. Former colleagues from Hargrove, a contact at a CPA firm, a woman I know who does forensic accounting for a nonprofit that works on financial transparency." She held his gaze. "Clean people, Tae-jun. Nobody connected to anything you do. People who would look at a shell company structure and follow the money the same way I would, because it's an interesting problem, and because I would ask them to." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you trust them?" "Yes." She waited a beat. "Do you trust me?" He looked at her for a long time. Not the evaluating look from their first conversation, when he'd been measuring what she was. Something different. Something that had no real name yet. "I'm still deciding," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. "Then we're even," she said. "Because so am I." She made the copies 2 nights later. She hadn't planned to. Or rather, she'd been aware, in the way she was always aware of contingencies, that having only 1 copy of anything important was a form of vulnerability. But she hadn't committed to the act until she was sitting alone in the office at 2 a.m. waiting for Tae-jun, who had been delayed by something he hadn't explained, With the full ledger of funds spread in front of her and a very clear and practical thought moving through her head, if this goes wrong, the only person who has no protection in this situation is you. Loretta's arrangement was verbal. The documents Tae-jun had promised on night one had not appeared. He hadn't mentioned them again, and neither had she, partly because she hadn't wanted to seem like she was pushing. A sound that she understood, now that she was inside something that moved on its own timeline regardless of what either of them wanted. But she was not going to be invisible again. She was done with invisible. She photographed every page of her assembled findings, 67 pages of her own handwritten analysis and the relevant source documents. She transferred the photographs to an encrypted folder on a cloud service she'd been using for personal financial records for 3 years, under an account name with no connection to her real identity. Then she wrote a brief summary document in plain language. What she'd found, what it implied, where the copies were stored. Instructions for accessing them, written for someone who was not a forensic accountant, in case the someone who eventually needed them wasn't. She printed 2 copies on the office printer, which she immediately regretted, printer logs, and then spent 10 minutes in the quiet of the office, figuring out how to clear the printer's internal memory, which she managed because she was resourceful and because the model was a commercial unit she'd worked with before. One printed copy she sealed in an envelope, which she took home and hid inside the lining of a winter coat at the very back of her closet. The coat she hadn't worn in 3 years because it was her mother's coat, and she kept it for reasons that had nothing to do with warmth. The second copy she tucked, 3 days later, into the personal belongings of the last place anyone connected to Tae-jun's world would ever think to look. The memory care facility. Into a waterproof folder slid behind the false bottom of the decorative storage box that sat on the shelf in Loretta's room, the one that looked like it held craft supplies, which it did mostly, except for the folder underneath the watercolors and the dried-out markers. Loretta would never look for it. She didn't look for anything anymore on bad days. On good days, she didn't particularly care about the storage box. Nobody in Tae-jun's orbit would ever think to look in a dementia patient's craft supplies box for financial intelligence. This was, Imani thought, exactly what it felt like to stop being invisible. Not loud, not obvious. Just quietly making sure that her own existence had weight and consequence, that she could not simply be erased from this situation the way she'd been erased from the Hargrove situation. Standing in the parking lot with a letter of clearance in her hand and nothing else. She was not doing that again. She told Tae-jun about the copies. Not where they were, but that they existed. She told him on a Wednesday night, 3 weeks into the work, sitting across his desk with the completed ledger between them, 67 pages of analysis, documenting exactly how Park Min-suk had constructed an 11-month financial pipeline, moving Tae-jun's money to Baekduhwan. She set the ledger on his desk. She said, "Before you read that, there's something you should know." He looked at her. "I've made a second copy of everything in that ledger," she said. "The analysis, the source documents, the full picture. It's stored somewhere you won't find it, under conditions that mean if something happens to me, it surfaces automatically." The silence that followed was the longest and heaviest silence they'd shared. "You don't trust me," he said. "I trust you as much as I trust anyone I've known for 3 weeks who runs a criminal organization." She kept her voice level. "That's not an insult. That's mathematics. I don't have enough information yet to calibrate higher than that. And if I told you that the existence of a second copy creates problems, then I'd say the solution is to not create problems." She held his gaze. "I'm not Hargrove, Tae-jun. I am not going to hand you evidence and then find myself standing in a parking lot with nothing. Whatever happens with what's in that ledger, however, this ends I exist in it. I have weight. I am not a resource you use and then have no further interest in." The muscle along his jaw worked once. She waited. "I wasn't going to discard you," he said. "Maybe not. But now you definitely aren't." She pushed the ledger across the desk toward him. "Read it. And then we need to talk about what happens next, because there are 2 promises you haven't put in writing yet, and I think we both know why we're past the point where that can wait." He opened the ledger. She watched his face as he read. He read slowly, the way someone reads when they're not just absorbing information but building something with it. A structure, a response, a decision. Halfway through, his hand went very still on the page. She knew which entry he'd reached, the quarterly amounts, the Honol connection, the 11 months. When he finished, he closed the ledger and set it flat on the desks, with a deliberateness that was its own kind of violence. He looked up. His eyes were completely still. "Do-won," he said, not as a question this time, as a verdict. "The money trail points there," Imani said. "I can't confirm the final endpoint without records outside this house. But everything I can see points to an organization that benefits from destabilizing yours. And the only organization that has both the motive and the access. Get out of the residence tonight," Tae-jun said. "Go home. Don't come back until I contact you." Imani went still. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make a phone call." Tae-jun Imani. The first time he'd said her name. Just her name, no title, no qualifier. The weight of it was different than she'd expected. "You have done what I asked. Now let me do what I do. Go home. Lock your door. Don't tell anyone what you found. And the promises. I will have the documents ready when I call you." She looked at him for a long moment. "If I don't hear from you within 72 hours, she said, "I'm going to assume something has gone wrong, and the copy exists for exactly that reason." Understood. She picked up her notepad, her pen, the personal belongings she'd accumulated over 3 weeks of night work in his office, and she walked to the door. At the door, she stopped. "For what it's worth," she said, not turning around, "whoever recommended Min-suk, your previous director, I'd want to know exactly where he retired to." She heard behind her the very quiet sound of Tae-jun picking up his phone. She left. The elevator doors closed. The residence fell away behind her floor by floor. And somewhere above her, in an office that smelled like old wood and tea and 11 months of lies, she'd spent 3 weeks excavating, the man who had just read everything she'd found was making a phone call that she understood. At a bone level she couldn't fully articulate, was going to change the shape of the next 72 hours in ways neither of them could completely predict. She stepped out into the frozen Seattle night. Her phone read 3:47 a. She walked to the bus stop, sat on the cold bench and waited. When the bus came, she got on. She did not sleep on the ride home. 3 days. Imani had said 72 hours. She'd meant it the way she meant most things she said precisely, with full understanding of what she was asking for and what would happen if she didn't get it. The first day, she cleaned her apartment, not because it needed cleaning. She was a professional cleaner by occupation, and her apartment was, by any reasonable standard, already clean. But her hands needed something to do while her brain ran the same calculations it had been running since she stepped off the bus at 4 a.m. And cleaning was the one activity she'd found over the past 18 months that let her think without her thinking getting in the way of itself. She scrubbed the bathroom grout with a toothbrush. She reorganized the cabinet under the kitchen sink. She took everything out of her refrigerator, wiped every shelf, put it all back. She did these things slowly, methodically, and thought about Min-suk. Specifically, she thought about the 6 years. 6 years was not an accident. 6 years was a career. A man who had spent 6 years inside a criminal organization, building a financial pipeline for a rival that was not someone who had gotten in over his head or made a bad decision under pressure. That was someone who had arrived with intention, with a specific job to do, and had done it. The degree falsification was almost elegant in its simplicity. The previous financial director does the hire. The previous director eventually retires or is retired, and nobody with current institutional knowledge ever thinks to check the paperwork that was supposedly verified years ago by someone who is now gone. Min-suk had understood the organization well enough to know exactly which gaps to hide in. That bothered her more than the money. The second day, she visited Loretta. Bad day. Not the worst Loretta. Had those were the days when she didn't recognize Imani at all, when she looked at her granddaughter with the polite, slightly alarmed expression of someone encountering a stranger who seems very sure they know her. Today was middle territory. Loretta knew someone she loved was in the room, knew the shape of the relationship, but the name kept slipping. "You came," Loretta said when Imani sat down. I always come, Grandma. I know. She patted Imani's hand without looking at it, the way you pat something familiar. You look like you haven't slept. I slept a little. How much is a little? Enough. Loretta made a sound that communicated clearly what she thought of that answer. They sat together for 2 hours. Imani read to her from the book on the nightstand, a novel about a woman who inherits a farm in rural Georgia and discovers it comes with 40 years of her family's buried secrets, which was the kind of book Loretta had always loved, stories where the land itself held memory. Loretta dozed partway through and woke up sharp, then dozed again. The room was warm. The window showed a gray sky holding the promise of more snow. At one point, in one of her alert moments, Loretta said, "Whatever you're in the middle of, baby, make sure you know your exits before you go all the way in." Imani kept reading. She said, "The third day, 11:15 p.m. Her phone rang. Same time as the night Loretta's care facility had called. Same numbers on the screen. Imani noticed that and filed it away in the part of her brain that collected details that might mean something, a habit from 4 years of financial investigation, where patterns were either significant or coincidence, and you didn't know which until much later. She answered on the second ring. Tae-jun's voice, "Come to the docks." 3 words plus a location. No greeting, no explanation. The call ended before she could ask. She sat on the edge of her bed for approximately 45 seconds. Then she put on her coat, the plain gray one, not her mother's, and her boots, and she picked up her phone and her keys, and she went outside to the street where a black sedan was already waiting. She had not told him her address. She got in anyway. The industrial waterfront in winter at midnight was a particular kind of ugly, not dramatic ugly, not the dark and stormy aesthetic of thriller movies. Just cold and gray and smelling of brine and diesel and the specific dampness of a city built at the edge of water it has never quite managed to domesticate. Shipping containers stacked in rows, floodlights on poles, creating islands of yellow light surrounded by stretches of dark. The sound of the water somewhere beyond the buildings, present but invisible. The sedan stopped outside a warehouse. She couldn't have identified from the outside as anything other than a warehouse. Large, unremarkable, the kind of building designed to look like it contained nothing interesting. The driver got out and opened her door without speaking. She walked in. The inside of the warehouse was warmer than the outside, which she registered, and then immediately stopped registering because the scene in front of her required her full attention, and she understood, in the first 3 seconds, that she had just walked into something that had already gone very wrong before she arrived. Tae-jun was standing. That was the first thing she checked, that he was upright, that he was present, that he was not in the condition of someone who had lost whatever confrontation had produced this situation. He was standing, but he was holding his left side in a way that a person holds a part of the muscle that has recently been damaged, with the particular careful rigidity that says, "I know if I breathe wrong, this gets significantly worse." He was injured. She took that in, pushed it to one side. Because across from Tae-jun, seated in a folding chair, with the calm posture of a man who had arranged everything in this room to his own satisfaction, was someone she had never seen before and recognized immediately. Baek Do-hwan. She'd found no photographs of him in any record she'd accessed. But the way Tae-jun's entire body had organized itself in relation to this man, not aggressive, not submissive, something between them that had the careful geometry of 2 forces that have been in opposition long enough to know exactly how the other one moves, that told her everything the absence of photographs hadn't. Do-hwan was older than she'd imagined. Late 60s, compact, with a face that had done a lot of living and expressed very little of it. His suit was dark and quiet. His hands rested open on his knees, which was the posture of someone who had no need to demonstrate readiness, because readiness was simply his permanent condition. He had 4 men positioned at the perimeter of the room. Tae-jun had 2 visible, standing behind him, with the rigidity of people who understood they were significantly outnumbered and were not going to be the ones to acknowledge it first. Do-hwan looked at Imani when she entered. He looked at her the way people had been looking at her for 33 years. When she walked into rooms, she wasn't expected to be in that rapid recalibration. The split second where the eyes do the math of this is not what I was prepared for. Then his expression settled into something that was either patience or its very convincing simulation. She is smaller than I expected, he said in English, and it took Imani a moment to understand that he was not talking to Tae-jun. He was talking to someone she hadn't yet seen. She turned. Min-sik was standing against the far wall. Later she would catalog the physical details of that moment the way she cataloged anomalies in financial records precisely, in order, noting what each one meant. Min-sik was not restrained. That was the first thing. He was standing freely, weight distributed normally, hands at his sides. He was not a prisoner in this room. He was not frightened. That was the second thing. He was watching her with an expression that had a quality she recognized after a moment as professional interest, the look of someone assessing whether a variable they'd accounted for is behaving as predicted. He was standing on Du-hwan's side of the room. That was the third thing. Not physically. Exactly, the room didn't have a clear demarcation line. But the spatial logic of it was unmistakable. Min-sik's position, his posture, the easy way his shoulders sat, he was in the part of the room that belonged to Du-hwan. He had not been exposed. He had not been captured. He had not been dragged here as part of whatever confrontation Tae-jun had initiated. He had walked in on his own. Imani's brain did the recalculation in approximately 2 seconds. What it produced was a cold and very specific understanding. Tae-jun's phone call had not gone the way he'd intended. Whatever move he had made in the 72 hours since she'd left the residence, Min-sik had seen it coming, had reported it, had given Du-hwan enough information to arrange this, which meant Min-sik had known, or suspected, that Tae-jun was looking, which meant her 3 weeks of careful, methodical, invisible work had not been as invisible as she'd believed. She looked at Min-sik directly. He met her eyes. "I noticed the printer memory had been cleared," he said. Not an accusation, just offered with the flat courtesy of a professional acknowledging a professional. 3 weeks ago, nobody else in the residence uses that printer. She said nothing. "You're good," he said, genuinely. "I didn't pick it up for almost 2 weeks. By then I could see the shape of what you'd found, but not the details. Not where the copies went." She still said nothing. His eyes tracked over her face with that same assessing quality. "I'm guessing the copies are somewhere I won't look." Somewhere outside his world entirely. A brief pause. That was smart. Min-sik. Du-hwan's voice was quiet and carried the room without effort. "She's not here to be complimented." Min-sik stepped back. Du-hwan looked at Imani. "Sit down," he said, not unkindly. Imani did not sit down. "Yuna is safe," Tae-jun said. He said it the way some man says something he needs the other person in the room to understand. Before anything else happens. Fast. Direct, with the particular urgency of someone managing information under pressure. Then he said, "She is safe for now." The 2 words after the pause were the ones that mattered. Imani looked at him. He was still holding his side. His jaw was tight and his eyes were doing something complicated, not fear. Tae-jun didn't seem capable of fear in any simple form, but something adjacent to it. Something that lived in the same neighborhood. Something that lived in the same neighborhood. The expression of a man who has identified the specific thing that can undo him and is watching it happen in real time. "Yuna was taken after school this afternoon," he said. "Du-hwan's men. She's being held somewhere I haven't been able to locate. The condition for her return, the ledger," Du-hwan said. "Or rather the copies, the one she's made." His eyes stayed on Imani. "We have Tae-jun's original. That was not difficult to acquire once we knew to look for it. The copies are the problem." Imani breathed. She breathed very carefully, the way she'd taught herself to breathe in the weeks after Hargrove, when she'd sit in the parking lot of whatever grocery store would hire her for a shift and feel the walls of her chest closing inward and force herself, methodically, to put air into her lungs and take air out, because panic was a luxury, and she had never been able to afford luxury. She breathed. Yuna was 14 years old. She went to a school. She had a backpack and a routine, and whatever 14-year-olds thought about on the bus ride home, and sometime between that bus ride and this moment, she had become a bargaining chip in a room full of men who had apparently decided that children were acceptable currency. Imani breathed. I want to talk to her, she said. Du-hwan tilted his head slightly. Excuse me, Yuna. I want to hear her voice. Right now, before this conversation goes any further, I want proof that she's unharmed, and I want to hear it from her directly. The room was quiet for a moment. Du-hwan looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, more like the adjustment a very experienced card player makes when a hand plays differently than the deck would suggest. He reached into his jacket, produced a phone, made a call of 2 words in Korean she didn't understand. 30 seconds. Then he held the phone toward her. A young woman's voice, frightened, but trying not to show it the precise vocal quality of someone who has been told to perform calm and is managing it imperfectly, which was more convincing than perfect calm would have been. I'm okay, Yuna said, in English, which meant she'd been told to speak English, which meant the phone call was partly for Du-hwan's benefit as much as anyone else's. I'm not hurt, Imani said. My name is Imani. I work for your uncle. Are you warm? A pause. Yes. Have they given you water? Yes. Okay. She kept her voice level and ordinary, the same voice she used when she talked to Loretta on bad days, not cheerful, not dramatic, just present. I am here. I am real. You are not alone. I'm going to handle this. You stay calm and keep breathing, okay? Another pause. Longer. Then, okay. Du-hwan took the phone back. He looked at Imani with that same assessing patience. The girl is unharmed, he said. She will remain unharmed, and she will be returned once the copies are destroyed in our presence. And after that, Imani said, what happens after that? After that, Tae-jun and I have a conversation about the future of our respective organizations without the interference of financial intelligence that shouldn't exist. And me, Du-hwan was quiet for a moment. You are a housekeeper. I was a housekeeper. You are a woman who cleaned floors in this man's house. Something in his voice that was not dismissal. Something more like a considered observation. You are not connected to his organization. You have no value to me beyond the copies you've made. Destroy them, and you go home. She looked at him. You'll let me walk out of here. I'll let you walk out of here. Just like that. Just like that. She held his gaze for 5 full seconds. No, she said. The silence that followed had a specific quality she would remember. For a long time afterward, the quality of a room full of people recalibrating simultaneously. Du-hwan's expression did not change. That was the most alarming part. A man who expects resistance builds it into his posture, his response time, the set of his shoulders. Du-hwan showed none of that. He simply waited, with the patience of someone who has had this conversation, or a version of it, many times before. Tae-jun had gone very still. She could feel his attention on her without looking at him, the specific weight of a person watching you walk to the edge of something they cannot pull you back from. No, Imani said again, because it had apparently not been clear enough the first time. I will not destroy the copies in your presence, and I won't destroy them in anyone else's presence either. And here's why. The second those copies disappear, I become the loose end. The housekeeper who knows too much, who is conveniently no longer verifiable as a threat. She looked directly at Du-hwan. You just told me I'm not connected to his organization. That's true. But it also means I'm not protected by the same rules that keep Tae-jun's people alive after a deal closes. I'm civilian. Civilian loose ends get tied off differently. Du-hwan said nothing. The copies stay where they are, Imani continued. But here's what I'll offer instead. The room waited. Yuna comes back unharmed tonight. All of her, exactly as she was when she got on the bus this morning. Tae-jun walks out of this building in the same condition he's currently in, which means nobody touches him between now and when we leave. And nobody goes near a woman named Loretta Bellrose, who has dementia and lives in a memory care facility and has absolutely nothing to do with any of this. She paused. If all of that happens, the copies don't surface. They stay where they are, silent, and they stay that way, as long as those conditions remain true. They become insurance rather than evidence. Nobody wins with them, but more importantly, nobody loses. Du-hwan looked at her for a very long time. Then he said, and if I decide you're bluffing, then you'll find out I'm not. About 8 to 12 hours after I failed to stop a process I set in motion before I got in that car tonight. She held his gaze without blinking. I had 3 days. I used some of them productively. It was a partial bluff. The copies existed. The encrypted folder existed. The version stored in Loretta's room existed. What did not yet exist was any automatic delivery mechanism. She hadn't had time, hadn't set that up, had been building as she went. But the only thing that mattered right now was the next 60 seconds of Du Huan's face. She watched it. He turned very slowly and looked at Tae-jun. "Where did you find her?" he said. Tae-jun's eyes stayed on Imani. "She found me," he said. The 72 minutes between that exchange and the moment Imani heard a car door outside the warehouse were the longest 72 minutes of her adult life. Du Huan did not immediately agree. He withdrew to the far end of the warehouse with 2 of his men and spoke in Korean for 11 minutes while Imani sat. She had finally sat in the folding chair Du Huan had vacated because her knees were not going to hold her upright for another 72 minutes on adrenaline alone, and she refused to let them give out while she was standing. Tae-jun moved to stand beside her, not close, adjacent. His right hand near the back of the chair without touching it. "Your side," she said quietly. "It's manageable. That's not a medical assessment." "No," a pause, 2 cracked ribs, possibly 3. "I've had worse." She didn't ask when, didn't ask how. Didn't ask what had happened in the 72 hours between her leaving the residence and this warehouse, because they were in the middle of something and she needed to stay in the middle of it, and the history could wait. "The bluff," he said. "Quieter the automatic delivery." "Partial bluff," she said, equally quiet. "How partial?" "The copies are real. The destination is real. The automatic part was an improvisation. That was an extremely specific improvisation to make in front of Baek Do-hwan. I'm good at numbers and I'm good at reading rooms, and right now the room was reading like he needed a reason to believe me more than he needed to call my bluff." She folded her hands in her lap. Her hands were cold. Was I wrong? Tae-jun looked across the warehouse at the tight cluster of Do-hwan and his men. "No," he said. "You weren't wrong." Min-sik was still against the far wall. She'd been tracking him in her peripheral vision this entire time, the way he stood, where his attention went, whether he was monitoring her or the conversation between Du-hwan and his men. He was watching Du-hwan, his whole body oriented that way, the attentiveness of a person waiting for a signal. 6 years of attentiveness, 6 years of standing in a room and waiting for signals from the person he actually worked for. She thought about the printer memory, 2 weeks before he'd noticed. That meant the first 2 weeks of her work had been genuinely invisible, and the last week had been conducted under observation she hadn't detected, by a man who'd decided the smart play was to watch what she was doing rather than immediately disrupt it. He'd wanted to know what she'd found. He'd let her find it. The shape of that made her feel cold in a way that the warehouse temperature didn't account for. "He knew I was close," she said. Tae-jun didn't ask what she meant. "Yes." He let me finish. "He needed to know what you'd found and where you'd put it. He couldn't disrupt you before you'd finished, without revealing that he knew you were looking." A pause. "You were more thorough than he expected. He said I was good." He wasn't wrong either. Across the room, Du-hwan turned. He walked back toward them with the unhurried gait of someone who has reached a decision and is not in any rush to announce it, because the decision is already made and the announcement is a formality. He stopped in front of Imani. She didn't stand. She met his eyes from the chair, which was a different kind of confrontation, but an equally clear one. 90 minutes, Du-hwan said. 72, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. 72 minutes, he said. 68 minutes later, they heard a car. Then a door. Then footsteps light and quick on the concrete floor. Yuna came through the warehouse entrance, still wearing her school backpack, which struck Imani as the most specific and gutting detail of the entire night that she'd been taken in transit, before she'd made it home. And she'd been held for hours in whatever room they'd put her in, still wearing the backpack that had her textbooks in it, still dressed for an ordinary Tuesday. She crossed the warehouse floor at something faster than walking. Tae-jun moved toward her without appearing to move quickly, that deliberate body control breaking, just slightly, for this one thing. Yuna hit him and stopped. His arms went around her. His injured ribs, he didn't flinch. He just held on. Imani looked away. She looked at the warehouse wall, at the floodlight outside the high windows, at the particular grain of the concrete floor. She gave them 30 seconds. When she looked back, Yuna was looking at her over Tae-jun's shoulder. Young face, red-eyed hair in the half-collapsed braid of someone who'd had a long and terrible afternoon. Looking at Imani with the specific intensity of someone committing a face to memory. Imani nodded, Yuna nodded back. Doo-won left without ceremony. His men followed. Min-suk left with them, which she noted not taken, not left behind. Gone with the organization, he'd been serving for 6 years while standing inside Tae-jun's. Tae-jun's 2 men materialized from wherever they'd been positioned and brought another car around. Tae-jun got Yuna into the car first. Then he turned. "Come," he said. "I'll take a car separately, Imani. You need to take her home. She needs to be somewhere familiar with someone she trusts, and she doesn't know me." She looked at him steadily. "I'll get back fine. A car will take you." "Okay." "Yes, a car," she paused. "We need to talk tomorrow. With the promises in writing and an attorney present who is not connected to your organization." He looked at her. "You walked into that warehouse tonight," he said, "knowing what you were walking into. I knew it was going to be bad. I didn't know the specific shape of bad. And you still—" He stopped. Started again differently. "The call with Yuna, that was not part of any negotiation. That was not leverage. You asked to hear her voice because she was frightened, and you wanted her to know someone was handling it." Imani looked at him for a moment. "She's 14, she said. She was scared. It was the right thing to do." "Yes," he said. "It was." He looked at her for another long moment with that expression that had been developing over 3 weeks of midnight offices and shared silences and accumulated difficult truths. The expression that still didn't have a clean name, but had gotten more specific over time. Then he got in the car. The car left. The car that took Imani home was driven by a man who said nothing, which she appreciated. She sat in the back and watched Seattle pass the windows the city at 2 a.m., reduced to its bones, the strip of lit windows and the dark water and the particular loneliness of a city, that large at that hour, all those lives folded up for the night, and only the ones with nowhere else to be still moving through it. She thought about Doo-won, agreeing. The logic was sound. She'd presented him with a genuinely balanced proposition. A situation where her copies were more useful as insurance than as evidence, and where everyone had more to lose from escalation than from a structured de-escalation. He was not an irrational actor. Irrational actors didn't build 6-year infiltration operations. He'd agreed because the math worked. But math could be recalculated. Circumstances could change. She thought about Min-sik walking out of the warehouse on Doo-won's side of the equation, with everything he knew about the financial structure of Tae-jun's legitimate businesses, and the specific and unpleasant knowledge that she had found his 6-year operation in 3 weeks of part-time work. She thought about what Doo-won would conclude from that fact. He would conclude that Imani Bellrose was a problem that had been contained tonight, but would need to be permanently resolved at some future, more convenient moment. The car stopped outside her building. She got out. Stood on the sidewalk. The cold hit her immediately sharper than the warehouse, more personal. The cold of her own street, in front of her own building, where she'd been coming home for 2 years. She stood there for a moment. Inside her coat pocket, her phone. Inside her apartment, the winter coat at the back of the closet with the envelope sewn into the lining. Inside a memory care facility across the city. Her grandmother sleeping and a waterproof folder tucked into the bottom of a craft supplies box that had just become the most important object in the situation. Because Doo-won didn't know where the copies were. She had not told Tae-jun where the copies were. Nobody in that warehouse tonight had the answer to the question that was now. She understood clearly. The axis, everything turned on. She was not invisible anymore. She was the only person in this entire situation who held something nobody else could take away without her participation. That was not the same thing as safety, but it was the closest thing to it she had ever held. She went inside, locked the door, sat down on her bed, and for the first time in 72 hours, she let herself feel everything she had not allowed herself to feel. While she was in that room, the adrenaline finally metabolizing. Her hands shaking slightly, The sound like shaming me now that there was nobody to perform steadiness for. The specific terror of having said no to a man like Duhuan and having meant it and having not known in that moment whether it would hold. It had held for tonight. But tomorrow was already moving toward her, and Duhuan was somewhere on the other side of it, and Min Sifix knew things about her operation that she hadn't yet fully accounted for, and Tae-jun still owed her documents that didn't exist yet. And somewhere in all of that, a 14-year-old girl was going home to an apartment where she would probably sit on her bed and shake too, and neither of them would sleep much. And in the morning, the city would look exactly the same as it always did, indifferent and ordinary, and none of what had happened in that warehouse would be visible on its surface at all. Imani pressed her palms flat against her thighs, breathed. Then she picked up her phone and started drafting an email to Deborah Osi with the subject line that read only, "I need a favor. Time sensitive. Call me when you're up." She was not going to wait for Duhuan to recalculate. She was going to build something he couldn't dismantle before he had the chance to try. Deborah called at 6:47 a.m. Imani had not slept. She'd been sitting at her kitchen table since 3 a.m. with her laptop open and a legal pad beside it, building the thing she should have built 3 days ago, the thing she'd improvised in that warehouse, and now had to make real before the improvisation expired. "Your email said time sensitive," Deborah said. No greeting. Deborah Osi operated on the principle that pleasantries were for people who had time to waste, and in 15 years of forensic accounting, she had never once had time to waste. How time-sensitive? Hours, not pause. Talk. Imani talked. She gave Deborah the version stripped of everything that would require explanation. No criminal organizations, no warehouses, no men with injured ribs. What she gave her was the financial architecture, shell companies, quarterly extraction patterns, a chain of entities she'd traced to a terminus that connected to a larger organization she couldn't name. She used the word client where the truth was more complicated. She said sensitive situation where the truth was more dangerous. Deborah was quiet through all of it. That was one of the things Imani had always respected about her. She listened the way accountants were supposed to listen, without interrupting, without filling silences with the sound of her own processing. When Imani finished, Deborah said, "How much of this is documented?" "Everything I've described. 67 pages of analysis plus source documents. And you need the handle chain closed. I need to know where it ends. Definitively. With documentation I can use." "Use how?" Imani looked at her kitchen wall. At the photograph on the counter herself, and Loretta at a backyard birthday party, Imani maybe 12, Loretta in a yellow dress laughing at something the camera hadn't caught. An ordinary Saturday, the world being ordinary without announcement. As insurance, she said. The kind that needs to be credible enough that the person it's aimed at believes destroying it would cost more than maintaining the current arrangement. Another silence. Longer Imani. Deborah's voice had shifted. The professional efficiency still there, but under it something human and careful. "Are you in something that's going to get you hurt?" "I'm trying to make sure the answer to that is no." "That's not the same as no." "I know," Deborah breathed. "I have a contact at the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Not someone I can call officially, but someone who can run an informal trace on the entity chain and tell me what the federal database shows about beneficial ownership." A pause. "It'll take until end of day. I need it by noon. Then I'll need you to owe me something significant." "I already owe you something significant. More significant than that." "Done," Imani said. "Whatever you need. Name it later." "I'll call you at 11:30, Deborah said, and hung up. At 9 a.m., Tae-jun's car arrived outside her building without a call. She'd been watching for it. Not because she'd expected it, but because she'd started watching the street from her window at 7:30 with the specific vigilance of someone who understands they have become visible to people they would prefer not to be visible to. She was downstairs before the driver reached her door. The car took her not to the waterfront residence, but to a different address, a building in Capitol Hill, clean and unremarkable, the kind of multi-unit residential building that existed in every neighborhood of every American city, and contained, by design, exactly nothing worth remembering. Tae-jun had more than one location. Of course he did. She rode up to the fourth floor. The apartment was plain and functional, furnished with the particular neutrality of a place maintained for operational use rather than habitation. A table, chairs, windows with the blinds adjusted to let in light without sight lines. Tae-jun was at the table. His left side had been properly wrapped. She could see the compression bandage visible, where his shirt sat differently at the ribcage, and his movement had the micro-careful qualities of someone managing pain with deliberate economy. 3 or 4 cracked ribs hurt with every breath, every twist, every unguarded moment. He was guarding everything. Yuna was not present. Good. She needed to be somewhere that wasn't any room where this conversation was happening. Across from Tae-jun sat a man Imani didn't recognize, 50s, Korean-American, in a dark suit with a briefcase open on the table in front of him. He had the look of a man who dealt in careful language for a living. "My attorney," Tae-jun said, "independent. He has represented my personal legal matters for 11 years and has no involvement in operational affairs." The attorney's name was Mr. Lim. He shook her hand and handed her a business card that gave an address in Bellevue and a firm name she didn't recognize. "I'd like to verify your independence before we continue," Imani said to him. Mr. Lim looked mildly surprised. Tae-jun did not. "What would satisfy you, Mr. Lim asked. "A conflict of interest disclosure, signed stating that you have no financial relationship with any entity connected to Kang Tae-jun's business operations beyond personal legal representation." "I'll take a photograph of it." Mr. Lim looked at Tae-jun. Tae-jun said, "Write it." Lim wrote it, signed it. Imani photographed it and sent it to an email address she'd created at 4 a.m. that morning for the specific purpose of receiving documents that needed to exist somewhere outside her phone. Then she sat down. The documents took 2 hours. Not because the content was complicated, Tae-jun had been specific, and Lim was efficient, but because Imani read everything 3 times before she signed anything. And there were 2 clauses in the initial draft she rejected and had rewritten. The first rejection, the provision for Loretta's care, had originally been structured through one of Tae-jun's holding entities, which meant it could theoretically be unwound if the entity changed structure. Imani had it rewritten as a direct, irrevocable endowment through an independent charitable trust that Lim's firm would administer. No connection to Tae-jun's operational structure, no mechanism for reversal. The second rejection, the professional reference, was originally framed as a letter from the household management company. Imani had it rewritten as a personal attestation from Tae-jun himself in his capacity as the property's principal resident, with a notarization that could be verified independently. "You read documents the way a litigator reads them, Mr. Lim said on the second rewrite. "I read documents the way someone who has been burned by what wasn't in them reads them," Imani said. Lim glanced at Tae-jun. Tae-jun said nothing. They initialed the final versions at 11:18 a.m. Imani had the originals. Copies went to Lim's office safe. She photographed every page. At 11:29 a.m., her phone buzzed. "Deborah, 1 minute early." Imani stood. "I need to take this privately." Tae-jun nodded. She went into the other room, a small kitchen with the same operational neutrality as the rest of the apartment, and answered. "Hanel Investment Group," Deborah said. "The beneficial ownership chain terminates with a holding entity registered in the Cayman Islands, which is in turn controlled by a Korean national named Baek Do-hwan, whose legitimate business holdings include 3 import-export firms operating through Seoul, Busan, and Vancouver." A pause. "He also has a FinCEN flag from 2019 for a suspicious activity report that was investigated and closed without charges, which means the federal government has a file on him and has chosen not to move on it, which usually means one of 2 things. Either they don't have enough," Imani said, "or they're watching him for something bigger." "Correct. I don't know which." Deborah paused. "Imani, whatever you're doing with this information, be careful. This man is not a small problem." "I know. You're sure?" "I was in a room with him last night." The silence on Deborah's end lasted long enough that Imani could hear her breathing. "I'm sending you the documentation through the encrypted channel we used for the Hargrove work," Deborah said finally. "It'll take 20 minutes to compile." Another pause. "And whatever you owe me, I'm adding hazard consideration." Fair, Imani said. She went back into the main room. Tae-jun looked at her face and read something there that made him sit forward slightly, careful of his ribs. Tell me, he said. She told him about Hanel, about the Cayman terminus, about the FinCEN flag. She watched his face during the FinCEN part. The same quality she'd seen in the warehouse, not surprise, but confirmation. The face of a man whose working theory has just been verified in a way that closes off remaining doubt. If the federal government is watching him, Imani said, then the last thing Do-hwan wants is any financial intelligence about his operation surfacing through unofficial channels. It would alert them that he knows he's being watched. It would change their strategy. It might accelerate a move he isn't ready for. Which means our copies are more valuable than I initially framed them last night, Tae-jun said. Significantly, they're not just leverage against a criminal negotiation. They're leverage against a federal investigation he's trying to stay invisible to. She let that settle. He agreed to 72 minutes last night because I presented a balanced proposition. He's going to wake up this morning and recalculate. He's going to realize the copies are a larger liability than he initially assessed, which means he'll move faster, which means we need to move faster. Tae-jun looked at her. What are you proposing? I'm proposing we don't wait for him to initiate the next contact. She pulled the chair out and sat down across from him. We request a meeting today. Before he's had time to build a new position, she set her phone on the table between them. And I go alone. The argument that followed lasted 19 minutes. Tae-jun's first position, she would not go alone. He had people. He would have 3 of them at any meeting location she chose, positioned outside. Imani's position, his people outside a meeting location, would tell Do-hwan that the meeting was not what she claimed it was, which would collapse the specific advantage she had that she was, in Do-hwan's assessment, a civilian, a housekeeper, someone outside the standard rules of engagement between organizations. Tae-jun's second position, the advantage of her civilian status, had already been substantially eroded by her performance in the warehouse. Imani's counterpoint, eroded, not eliminated. Do-hwan had watched her negotiate effectively for a 14-year-old girl and produce documentation he hadn't anticipated. That was impressive, but it was not threatening. She had not threatened him. She had offered him a rational transaction. He respected that. She needed to go back to him as the same person, not as an emissary of Tae-jun's organization, with backup parked outside. Tae-jun, if something went wrong. Imani, if something went wrong. The document she'd signed this morning already existed. Loretta was already protected, and the copies were already somewhere. Do-hwan couldn't reach them. If something went wrong, the situation was already better than it was 12 hours ago. Tae-jun looked at her across the table for a long moment. That is the most deliberately unemotional risk assessment I have ever heard from someone describing their own potential harm, he said. I'm a numbers person, she said. I risk assess in my sleep. You didn't sleep. Figuratively. He pressed his hand flat against the table. She could see the deliberate steadiness of it, the same compression he applied to his breathing when the ribs pulled. Keeping everything controlled through force of will and the practiced habit of a man who had learned not to let pain show, because showing it was information someone else could use. One condition, he said. Name it. You call me when you arrive and when you leave. If I don't hear from you within 30 minutes of the scheduled end of the meeting, I don't wait. Agreed, she said. She picked up her phone and made the call. Do-hwan chose the meeting location. She'd expected that, had counted on it, actually. A man like Do-hwan did not go to locations chosen by the other party. He would need the psychological advantage of familiar ground, or at least ground he'd controlled in advance. What she hadn't expected was what he chose. A waterfront cafe in the Pike Place market area. Morning crowd. Tourist foot traffic beginning to build even in January, because Pike Place was Pike Place regardless of season. Public tables. Exposed sightlines, the particular noise density of a busy cafe that made it impossible to record a conversation, clearly and equally impossible to escalate anything without 40 witnesses. He'd chosen a public location. That told her something. She arrived 8 minutes early, ordered coffee she didn't drink, and chose a table against the wall with a direct sight line to both the entrance and the service exit. Old habit from 4 years of accounting in environments where she'd learned that knowing where these exits were was professional due diligence. Doo-won arrived at exactly 10 o'clock, alone, which she hadn't expected, and which recalibrated her threat assessment immediately. He sat across from her, without looking around the cafe, without checking the room. He had already checked it. Someone had checked it before she arrived. He ordered tea from the server, who appeared immediately, which meant he'd been here before, and was known. He looked at Imani with the same measured patience he'd had in the warehouse. "You called quickly," he said. "I thought we'd both sleep better with this finished." "Did you sleep?" "No." Something at the corner of his mouth. "Neither did I." He let the server bring his tea and withdraw before he spoke again. Around them, the cafe noise built orders called out, chairs scraping, a family with 2 children navigating the narrow space between tables. The ordinary world indifferent to everything happening at this particular table. "I spent the night," Doo-won said, "considering your position. And I concluded that you are either the most deliberately dangerous woman I have encountered in 40 years of business or the most accidentally dangerous one. I have not yet determined which. Does it matter? For how I respond to you, yes." Considerably, he lifted his tea. "Set it down without drinking. Min-suk tells me you found his work in 3 weeks. 2.5. He had 6 years to build it. 6 years of hiding it is different from 3 weeks of finding it. The person hiding something knows what they're hiding. The person finding it has to reconstruct the logic from the wrong end." She kept her voice level. He was very good. The layering was sophisticated. "If I hadn't been looking for something specific, I might have taken much longer." "What were you looking for?" "Consistency that was too consistent." A pause. "Legitimate business has noise. Vendors are late. Volumes fluctuate. Claims cluster around real events. His structure was too clean. The payments were too regular. Real sloppiness is what healthy books look like. His were perfect, and perfect is a flag." Doo-hwan looked at her for a moment with an expression she was starting to recognize the evaluation of a person who has spent decades accurately assessing human capability and is adjusting a prior assessment upward. "What do you want?" he said. "I want to tell you about the Hanel chain," she said. He went very still. "I traced it to Terminus this morning," she said. "I know where the money ends. I know the ownership structure. I know about the Finsian flag from 2019. She kept her eyes on his. "I'm not telling you this as a threat. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that the conversation we're having right now is the one that determines whether any of that information ever becomes relevant to anyone other than the 2 of us sitting at this table." The cafe noise continued around them. Someone behind her was laughing at something. The espresso machine released a burst of steam. Doo-hwan said nothing for a long time. Then continue. She had prepared for 2 hours. She had the numbers in her head, organized the same ways. She organized any complex financial presentation sequenced, layered, each component building toward a conclusion that was clear before she stated it. She laid out the terms. The financial extraction from Tae-jun's legitimate businesses would cease completely and immediately. The shell company chain Pacific Rim Freight, Cascade Insurance, the ghost payroll at the laundromats, the full Hanel pipeline would be formally dissolved over 90 days, with documentation she could verify. The non-aggression between the 2 organizations would be formalized. Not in writing, she understood enough about how these things worked to know that written agreements between criminal organizations were worse than useless but formalized in the structural sense, with specific mechanisms built into both organizations' financial operations that would make violation detectable. She would design those mechanisms herself. Copies she held would remain inaccessible and undelivered, as long as every element of the above remained true. They would become, as she'd told Doo-won in the warehouse, insurance rather than evidence. Then she told him the last condition. He hadn't expected it. She could see that the slight forward shift of his attention, the way his hands resettled on the table. "There is a charitable foundation," she said, "that finances memory care programs. It currently protects 1 person. I want it to protect more. I want an endowment structured through legitimate channels, with clean money that funds expanded memory care access for families that can't afford secured dementia care. She looked at him steadily. You have legitimate business holdings. You have charitable giving capacity. I want this to be part of the structural resolution. You want me, Duhuan said slowly, to fund a dementia care foundation. I want both parties in this arrangement to fund it. Jointly, through independent administration. Why? She looked at him without looking away. Because your operation and the organization you've been funding with Tae-jun's money, that whole system extracts value from situations where people are already losing, she said. Families in financial crisis are invisible to power structures until they become useful. I know what that feels like from the inside. I want something that uses the leverage created by this situation to protect people who will never be at a table like this one. A pause. You're not being asked to become a good person. You're being asked to make one decision that has a good consequence. Those are different things. Duhuan sat back in his chair. He studied her face for a long moment. You're not doing this for money, he said. No. What are you doing it for? For the woman in the memory care facility who wandered out into the snow in slipper, she said. And for every other family sitting in a parking lot right now, trying to figure out how $1,100 a month becomes possible. She kept her voice even. And if I'm being honest, for the version of myself that was standing in a parking lot 2 years ago, holding a letter that said I was cleared of something I didn't do, and understanding that cleared doesn't mean anything if the world has already decided what you are. The cafe noise, the steam, someone's child asking for hot chocolate somewhere behind her. Duhuan looked at his tea. Min-suk, he said, removed from any access to either organization's financial records. Permanently. She paused. What you do with him after that is not my concern. I only care about his access and Tae-jun's restructuring. Independent professional oversight for the legitimate businesses. I can recommend qualified CPAs, clean ones, a beat. Ironically, I have some experience identifying the unclean variety. Something crossed Duhuan's face. Not quite amusement. Something adjacent to it, the recognition of a person in an unexpected situation, finding unexpected competence in an unexpected place. You walked into my warehouse last night, he said, with no protection. No leverage I could verify. A partial bluff and a telephone conversation with a frightened child. He looked at her. Why? Because the alternative was waiting, she said. I've been waiting for other people's decisions to determine my circumstances for 2 years. I'm done waiting. Duhuan was quiet for a moment. Then he said the foundation. How large an endowment? And Imani, who had prepared for this question too, gave him the number. She called Tae-jun at 12:47 p.m. It's done, she said, a silence. Then, are you... I'm fine. Meet me at the residence at 3. Bring Mr. Lim. She hung up. She sat at the table for another few minutes after Duhuan left, with her untouched coffee going cold in front of her and the cafe noise washing around her. And she thought about what had just happened and what it would take to make it permanent and what permanent even meant in situations like this. It meant documentation. It meant the kind of structural guarantees that made violation more costly than compliance. It meant keeping the copies exactly where they were and making sure the mechanism for their release was real now. Not improvised. She needed to call Deborah again. Needed to build the actual infrastructure to support the deterrent she'd invented in a warehouse at midnight. She had approximately 4 hours. She paid for the coffee. Put on her coat. At the door of the cafe, she stopped. Through the window, she could see Pike Place in January, the market stalls, the gray sky, the water visible beyond the buildings, the ordinary machinery of a city going about its ordinary business. People with groceries, a delivery driver with a hand truck, couple sharing an umbrella, even though it wasn't currently raining, just in case. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the door for a moment. Then she pushed through it and walked out. The 3 o'clock meeting lasted 4 hours. Tae-jun, Mr. Lim, Imani, and via a phone conference that Lim arranged on 30 minutes' notice, a second attorney from a firm with no connection to either organization. A woman named Patricia Sandoval, who specialized in nonprofit trust administration, and asked 3 extremely sharp questions before agreeing to participate. They built the structure in real time. Imani drafted the financial verification mechanisms, the tripwires she'd described to Doo-won, the patterns that would make a return to the extraction model detectable without requiring active monitoring. She wrote them in plain language first, then Lim translated them into legal architecture. The foundation framework was Patricia Sandoval's domain. She was efficient and asked no questions about the unusual circumstances of the funding, which either meant she was very professional or very well compensated, and possibly both. The endowment structure she proposed was clean and irrevocable, with an independent board of administrators, no beneficial connection to either Tae-jun or Doo-hwan, and a mandate specific enough that the money could only be used for exactly what Imani had specified. At 6 p.m., while Lim and Sandoval were reviewing the final language on the verification mechanisms, Tae-jun's phone rang. He looked at the screen. His face changed in the specific way she'd learned to read over the past 3 weeks, the compression, the gathering. He stepped out of the room to take the call. He was gone for 4 minutes. When he came back, he set his phone on the table very carefully and looked at Imani. "Min-suk," he said. She waited. "He was found an hour ago in the parking structure of a building in Sodu." A pause. "He's alive, significantly injured. Doo-hwan's people, I assume." Imani held very still. "He was carrying something," Tae-jun said. "It was recovered by my people before anyone else reached the scene." He reached into his jacket and placed a USB drive on the table between them. His own records. 6 years of operational documentation. Everything he kept for himself as insurance against Doo-hwan. She stared at the drive. "Min-suk kept copies too," she said. "He was an accountant," Tae-jun said. "He understood that the person with the most complete record has the most leverage. Doo-hwan's people found him before he could use it." "Yes." She looked at the drive, at everything it represented 6 years of documentation that Min-sik had assembled as his own protection, now sitting on a table in an apartment in Capitol Hill because the man who'd sent people to take it from him hadn't anticipated that Tae-jun's people were watching the same parking structure. "That drive," Imani said slowly, "combined with what I've documented that's not insurance anymore." "No," Tae-jun said, "it isn't, if Doo-hwan knows Min-suk had his own records." "He knows. Then he knows those records are now with us." "Yes." The room was very quiet. Lim and Sandoval had both gone still, with the attentiveness of people who understand they are witnessing something developed that is outside their professional domain, but directly adjacent to it. Imani looked at Tae-jun. "He's going to move tonight," she said. "I think so. The cafe meeting bought us hours, not days." "Yes." She reached out and picked up the drive, held it in her palm. It weighed almost nothing. 30 grams, maybe. 6 years of a man's secret life, his protection and his contingency, and the evidence of everything he'd done and everything Doo-hwan had told him to do. "If we use this," she said, "we're not negotiating anymore." "No," Tae-jun said, "we're not." She looked at him. His eyes were steady. The pain from his ribs was visible, only in the very slight shallowness of his breathing, and the careful way he held his left side without appearing to hold it. Everything else was completely controlled, completely present. That gathering quality she'd first noticed in the warehouse, all of him pointed at a single point. At her, waiting for her to tell him what came next. She set the drive back on the table. She thought about Doo-hwan recalculating. About the speed at which a man who'd been watching federal investigators circle him for 3 years would move when he understood that the financial documentation he'd spent 11 months having Min-sik build was now fully documented by an outside party and held by 2 people he couldn't easily reach. She thought about Loretta in her south-facing room and the craft supplies box and the waterproof folder. She thought about Yuna on the bus with her backpack on a Tuesday that had turned into something else entirely. She thought about a parking lot 2 years ago and a letter that said cleared and meant nothing. "Call Patricia back in," she said. Tae-jun looked at her. "We need to accelerate the foundation timeline," she said. "It needs to be legally established before midnight tonight. Not a plan, not a draft executed. Funds transferred. Board appointed. Existence verifiable by anyone who runs a public records search." She looked at Patricia Sandoval, who had been listening from the doorway with her legal pad against her chest. "Can you do that?" Sandoval looked at the clock on the wall. It'll cost more, she said. Do it, and I'll need the funding wire initiated in the next 40 minutes. Imani looked at Tae-jun. He reached for his phone. 40 minutes, he said. Sandoval was already dialing. And somewhere across Seattle, in whatever room Baek Do-won was sitting in, a man who had spent 6 years building something in the dark was beginning to understand that the dark had been lit from inside without his knowledge. And the woman who had done it was still moving, still building, and she had not stopped yet. The foundation existed at 11:47 p.m. Patricia Sandoval sent the confirmation email at 11:47 p.m. and 13 seconds. Imani was watching the clock on the wall of the Capitol Hill apartment when the phone buzzed in her hand, and she looked at the timestamp the way she looked at all significant numbers, precisely, committing it to memory before she let herself respond to what it meant. Bellrose Memory Care Foundation registered. Funded. Board appointed Patricia herself, a retired physician Sandoval knew from nonprofit work, and a community advocate from the Rainier Valley neighborhood where Imani had grown up. Publicly searchable as of midnight. Irrevocable. She set the phone on the table. Tae-jun was across the room on a call he'd been on for 11 minutes, speaking in Korean in the low, deliberate register she'd learned to identify as the voice he used when giving instructions he needed followed exactly. Lim had left an hour ago. The apartment was quiet, except for Tae-jun's voice and the sound of the heating system and the city outside the windows doing whatever cities do after 11 p. In January. She looked at the USB drive on the table. Min Sok's records. 6 years of documentation that had survived its creator's attempt to use it as protection against the man who'd hired him. Survived Do-won's attempt to recover it. Survived the parking structure in Sodu and whatever had happened there in the dark, and was now sitting on a table in an apartment it was never supposed to reach. She picked it up. She had not yet looked at what was on it. She'd been building infrastructure for 6 hours, the foundation, the verification mechanisms, the accelerated timeline. She'd been doing what she did, which was work, because work was the thing she trusted to hold when everything else was uncertain. But now, the work was done, and the drive was in her hand, and she understood it was going to determine whether everything she'd built in the last 6 hours held or collapsed before morning. Tae-jun ended his call. He walked back to the table and sat down across from her and looked at the drive in her hand. Do-hwan knows Min-suk had records, she said. He knows those records are here now. He's not going to wait to see what we do with them. No, Tae-jun said. How long? My people think he'll move before dawn. A pause. He has 3 options. He moves against this location, which he may not have found yet. He moves against the residents, which he knows. Or he moves against the foundation documentation before it becomes publicly verifiable. Tae-jun's eyes were steady. The foundation is already verifiable. The residence is empty. I moved everyone out at 8 p. This location is clean. You moved everyone out at 8. Yes, you anticipated this. I anticipated that something would move tonight. The specific shape, the parking structure. Min seeks records that I didn't anticipate. He looked at the drive. But I understood that once the foundation was in motion, Do-hwan would read it correctly. He'd read it as us going public. He'd read it as the activation of a deterrent that no longer required our personal safety to function. Tae-jun's jaw was set. Which is exactly what it is. She looked at him. That was the point, she said. Wasn't it? That's why you were willing to accelerate the timeline. Push, Patricia. Wire the funds tonight. Not just because Do-hwan was recalculating, because you wanted the foundation to exist before he could move, so that moving against us became structurally irrelevant to stopping the documentation from surfacing. Yes, he said. She set the drive on the table between them. You could have told me that's what you were doing. You had already figured it out, he said. You didn't need me to tell you. She breathed, looked at the drive, looked at him. The copy's in Loretta's room, she said. I need to tell you where they are. He shook his head. No. Tae-jun, if I know where they are, they become something that can be taken from you. His voice was flat and absolute. Right now they are yours. They stay yours. Whatever happens tonight, that doesn't change. She sat with that for a moment. Then she opened her laptop and plugged in the drive. What was on Min-suk's drive took 3 hours to review. Not because it was complex, Min-sik had organized it with the same precise layering he'd applied to Tae-jun's books, which meant it was actually the clearest documentation she'd ever seen of a long-term financial infiltration operation. Clean folders, dated records, cross-referenced transactions. But none. The work of a man who had understood from the beginning that his only real protection was knowing than anyone else and keeping it organized enough to use quickly. What took 3 hours was the scope. Min-sik hadn't just documented the 11-month extraction pipeline she'd traced. He documented 6 years of operational intelligence he'd passed to Do Hwan, organizational structures, cash flow patterns, personnel movements, the financial fingerprints of every legitimate business in Tae-jun's portfolio. He'd built Do Hwan a complete picture of everything Tae-jun owned and how it all worked together. And buried in year 4, in a subfolder labeled with a date rather than a description, she found something she hadn't expected. The previous financial director, the man who had hired Min-suk, whose retirement had conveniently removed the one person who could have verified Min-suk's credentials. He hadn't retired. There was a payment record, a single payment, 4 years ago, from a Hanel subsidiary to an account in Vancouver. The amount was substantial. The memo line read only consulting, which was the word people used when they needed a word that wasn't the real word. He'd been paid to leave, or paid to be quiet, or both. She stared at that record for a long time. Then she looked at Tae-jun. He was watching her face. The previous director, she said. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did a very small shift, the kind she'd learned to read over weeks of watching a face that gave nothing away easily. "Show me," he said quietly. She turned the laptop toward him. He looked at it for a long moment, looked at the amount, looked at the date. He sat back in his chair. She waited. "His name is Han Jae-won," Tae-jun said. "He worked with me for 9 years, a pause that carried more weight than a pause usually carried. I attended his retirement dinner. I gave a speech. The silence between them was the particular silence of a person absorbing a betrayal that has been waiting in the past for years to become real." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say, and she understood enough about how he processed things to know that what he needed from her right now was not words. He closed the laptop. "Everything on that drive," he said. "Everything," she confirmed. "Send it to Deborah." She looked at him. "The forensic accountant," he said. "The one with the Finson contact. Send her the full drive with a summary of what it documents. Have her hold it with the same conditions as the rest of the copies." A pause. "And then I want you to do something I haven't asked you to do before." "What?" "I want you to decide what we do with it." Imani looked at him for a long moment. "You're asking me to decide." "You built the structure," he said. "You built the foundation, the verification mechanisms, the deterrent. You walked into Duwan's warehouse and his cafe. You've been 3 steps ahead of every move in this since the night you told me no outside my office door." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking you to decide because this is your work. You should have the authority that goes with it." She looked at the closed laptop, at the drive, at the city outside the window doing its indifferent 3A thing. She thought about Do Hwan, about what a man in his position would calculate when he understood that Minstructures were now incorporated into a deterrent structure already in motion, already legally established, already beyond the point where any single action against any single person could stop it. She thought about the Finson flag, about a federal investigation that had been watching and waiting for something worth moving on. "We don't use it as evidence," she said. "Not directly. Not through channels that would connect it back to this situation. No, but we make sure the Finson contact knows it exists. Not what it contains, not where it came from. Just that there is a comprehensive 6-year financial record of the Hanel operation in the hands of a forensic accountant who has already filed a SAR query through legitimate channels." She looked at him. "We let the federal machinery do what federal machinery does when someone tells it where to look." Tae-jun looked at her. "That puts Do Hwan in a position where moving against us becomes a federal visibility problem," he said, "and removes us from the equation entirely." She paused. "We're not informants. We're not witnesses. We're a forensic accountant doing her job and a property owner whose legitimate businesses were the subject of financial misconduct. That's all anyone needs to know. That's clean. I like clean, she said. She picked up her phone and called Deborah. Du-hwan's move came at 4:23 a.m., not against the Capitol Hill apartment, not against the residents, against the foundation. Splitting. Specifically against the independent attorneys who had administered it through a legal challenge filed in King County at the opening of business the following morning, claiming the endowment had been established under fraudulent pretenses and should be dissolved pending investigation. It was, she thought, when she read it, the most sophisticated response available to him. Not violence, not direct confrontation, a legal mechanism using the same structural tools she'd used to build the foundation, aimed at unbuilding it. It was also, she thought, 6 hours too late. Patricia Sandoval called at 8:15 a.m. With the controlled energy of a litigator who has just been given a problem, she is extremely confident she can solve. They've filed, Patricia said. I know. The legal theory is thin. The endowment documentation is airtight. The funding is clean. The board appointment follows every procedural requirement. A pause. This is harassment, not litigation. He's trying to tie it up long enough to create uncertainty. How long can he tie it up? With the filing they've made. Maybe 30 days if we let it drag. With active opposition, a week, maybe less. Patricia paused. The question is whether you want to oppose it, quietly or loudly. Loudly, Imani said. File in public record, every motion, every response. Make the challenge visible. That exposes the existence of the foundation to media attention. Good, another pause. You want press coverage. I want it to be the kind of situation where making it go away quietly becomes more costly than letting it stand. Imani looked out the window of the Capitol Hill apartment where she'd spent the night on the couch with her coat as a blanket. He challenged a dementia care foundation. In public. During a legal filing that will become part of the public record. I want that story available to anyone who looks for it. Patricia was quiet for a moment. You're not just trying to preserve the foundation, she said. You're making the challenge itself part of the deterrent. A man willing to attack a memory care charity in open court, Imani said, is a man whose profile in the legitimate business community gets considerably more complicated. I'll file the opposition by noon, Patricia said. Du-hwan withdrew the legal challenge at 4:48 p.m. No explanation, no accompanying statement. It simply disappeared from the filing system as if it had never been submitted, which was the legal equivalent of a man realizing mid-sentence that he'd said the wrong thing in the wrong room to the wrong audience. Patricia called to confirm. Imani was at the memory care facility when the call came. Sitting in the chair beside Loretta's bed, not reading today, just sitting, because some days sitting was enough. She stepped into the hallway to take the call, listened, said thank you, Patricia, hung up, stood in the corridor for a moment with the phone in her hand and the particular fluorescent light of a care facility corridor on her face, and the sounds of the building around her, a television, somewhere, a call bell, the soft footsteps of a staff member going past with a medication tray. She thought about the parking structure in Sodu, about Min-seok, who was alive somewhere in a hospital bed, which meant he was a variable that still existed in this equation that hadn't been resolved cleanly. She went salt. She thought about what Min-seok would do when he was recovered enough to make decisions, whether he would run, whether he would cooperate with federal investigators who would now know exactly where to look for exactly what they needed, whether he would find some third option she hadn't modeled. She thought about Han Jae-won in Vancouver, about a retirement dinner and a speech and 9 years of apparent loyalty that had been, at some point she couldn't precisely identify, quietly sold. She thought about Du-hwan, withdrawing his legal challenge, calculating the new landscape. The FinCEN contact Deborah had reached. The 6-year record sitting in forensic accountants' hands in a format admissible enough to support a federal investigation that had been waiting for exactly this kind of structure. He was not finished. She didn't believe that. Men like Du-hwan didn't finish. They recalibrated. They waited. They identified new angles. But the angle of coming directly at her, or at Tae-jun, or at the foundation, that angle had closed. The cost was now too high, the exposure too significant, The federal machinery, too close to having everything it needed. It wasn't victory. It was the particular kind of stability that comes from having made yourself too costly to attack. She went back into Loretta's room. Loretta was having a good day. Not perfect, the thread of conversation. Slipped twice, and once she called Imani by her mother's name, which happened sometimes and which Imani had learned to receive without correction, because the correction caused more distress than the mistake. But her eyes were clear. She was present. "You look different," Loretta said. Different how? Like something finished. Loretta studied her granddaughter's face with the particular attentiveness of someone who has spent decades reading the people she loves. Not over, not done. Just a chapter closing. Imani looked at her hands in her lap. "Something like that," she said. "Is the man part of it? Grandma, the complicated one." Loretta's voice was patient and unimpressed with evasion. "Is he done being complicated, or is he just a different kind of complicated now?" Imani was quiet for a moment. "The second one," she said. Loretta made a sound that managed to be simultaneously unsurprised and deeply aware. "Your mother," she said, "fell for a complicated man. Your grandfather was the most complicated human being I have ever encountered in my 78 years of living." She folded her hands on the blanket. "Complicated isn't the problem, baby. Complicated men who don't respect the person they're complicated with, that's the problem." A pause. "Does he respect you?" Imani thought about the signed documents. About you should have the authority that goes with it. About a folder on an attorney's desk in Bellevue with her name on every page. About 3 weeks of late nights in which a man who could have been 100 different kinds of threat had been, instead, only exactly what he said he was. "Yes," she said, "he does." Loretta nodded once, with the finality of someone closing a case. "Then figure out the rest as you go," she said. "That's what everyone does anyway, no matter what they tell you." She resigned from the housekeeping agency on a Thursday morning. Not by phone. She went in person to the small office in the Soto district where the agency operated, and she sat down across from the manager, a tired woman named Carol, who had always treated Imani with basic dignity, which she'd appreciated, and she said that she was leaving to pursue other professional opportunities, and thanked her for the work. Carol said she was sorry to lose her. Imani said she was not sorry to go. She meant it without cruelty. Carol understood. She went back to the waterfront residence that afternoon for the last time. Not as an employee, the resignation from the agency had taken care of that. She went to collect a small number of personal items she'd accumulated over 18 months in the cleaning supply cabinet she'd been assigned, a travel mug, a pair of good gloves, a paperback novel she'd been reading on break for 3 months and still had 80 pages left in. Mrs. O met her at the service entrance. They looked at each other for a moment with the specific acknowledgement of two women who had operated in close proximity for 18 months without ever quite existing in the same world. "The regular cleaning schedule will be disrupted, Mrs. O said. "Yes," Imani agreed. "I imagine it will." "You were reliable, Mrs. O said. Was coming from her approximately the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Thank you," Imani said. She collected her mug and her gloves and her paperback and folded the gray uniform neatly on the kitchen counter, which was the right way to leave any job. And she walked out through the service, and she walked out through the Sistuents, and through the side gate, and onto the waterfront path that ran along the edge of the property. She stopped. The lake was gray and flat and enormous, the kind of flat that made it look solid from a distance, until you were close enough to see the small movements on its surface. The sky above it was that particular Seattle winter white that wasn't quite overcast and wasn't quite clear, something in between. A few ducks near the shoreline, the smell of cold water, and the distant sound of traffic from the bridge. She stood there for a moment. She had been invisible in this place for 18 months. She had stood outside a door and cried about $1,100, and a man had opened the door and offered her something. And she had said no, and somehow that no had been the beginning of everything that followed. She thought about what it had cost. 3 weeks of double life. 1 warehouse negotiation. 1 cafe conversation across from a man who had calculated 6 years of patience. A parking structure in Sodo. A USB drive with someone else's insurance on it. A foundation built at midnight under deadline pressure. a legal challenge withdrawn at 4:48 p.m. on a Thursday, and Min Suk in a hospital somewhere, and Han Jae-won in Vancouver, who would eventually be found by people better equipped to find him than she was, and Do-won in whatever room he was currently occupying, recalculating again, as men like him always did and always would. She pulled on her gloves, turned away from the lake. She did not look back at the residence. The office space was in the Central District. Second floor of a mixed-use building, above a laundry and next to an insurance agency, reachable by a staircase that smelled of old wood and the particular history of a building that had been something different every decade for 60 years. The previous tenant had been a small tax preparation service. The windows faced east and caught the morning light. The ownership transfer documents had been prepared by Mr. Lim. She'd spent 2 days reviewing them, not because she mistrusted the preparation, but because she needed to understand every provision before she signed anything with her name on it, and because there was something in the act of reading carefully that made things real in a way that being told about them did not. Bellrose Accounting and Advisory, registered in Washington State. Sole proprietorship. Real clients, 3 of them. At opening, businesses she'd been connected to through Deborah's network, with no connection to Tae-jun's operations, with clean books she'd reviewed before accepting. The transfer was complete on a Monday morning. She stood in the empty office with the keys in her hand and looked at the walls and the light coming through the east-facing windows and the scuff marks on the floor from the previous tenant's desk and thought, this is what starting over looks like. Not dramatic, not clean, just a room with scuff marks and light and your name on a piece of paper that means it's yours. She'd bought a second-hand desk from a furniture consignment shop in Columbia City and carried it up the stairs, with the help of the building manager, a big man named Dennis who asked no questions and accepted $20 for his time. She'd brought a lamp from her apartment. She'd spent $45 at an office supply store and another $22 at the dollar store across the street. She set up her desk, turned on her laptop, opened the first client file. The work was the same work. It had always been numbers, patterns, the particular quiet satisfaction of a system in balance. The room was her own. The door had her name on it, not stenciled yet, but written in masking tape in her own handwriting, because she'd get to stenciling when she got to it. She worked until 6 p.m. Then she locked up and went to see Loretta. The weeks that followed had a texture she had not experienced before. Not easy, she wasn't interested in easy, didn't trust it as a category. But settled. The kind of days that had weight and consequence, and also, in small but genuine ways, pleasure. The accounting work was real and required her actual brain, which was something she'd missed in 18 months of mops and corridors. Sip scene. Client relationships were straightforward people with small businesses who needed someone to help them understand their own numbers, which was the basic and honest version of the work she'd trained to do. Deborah sent 3 referrals in the first month. Patricia Sandoval sent 1. The 4th client was a woman who ran a food truck operation in the International District and had been managing her own books for 3 years with increasing desperation. Imani spent 2 sessions helping her understand where her actual margins were and walked out of the second sessions with the feeling she associated with good work, tired, satisfied, light. The particular intellectual cleanliness of a problem solved correctly. She thought about Loretta's voice. A broken handle doesn't mean it can't hold coffee. She bought a ceramic mug from a street market near the Pike Place and put it on her desk. Tae-jun restructured his legitimate businesses in the following 90 days. She knew this not because she was involved. She wasn't. She had been clear about that. But because Mr. Lim kept her informed as a condition of the documentation she'd signed, which included a provision she'd written herself requiring notification of any structural changes during the transition period. The shipping company went under independent professional management. The restaurants and laundromats were transferred to a holding entity with a 3-person board of managers, none of them connected to any operational side of his prior activities. The parking businesses were sold to a legitimate commercial real estate group. She verified each notification, checked each document, filed each confirmation. The last notification came 63 days after the foundation was established. She read it at her desk in the Central District office, with the morning light coming through the east windows, and the sound of traffic from the street below, and the small, unglamorous machinery of a working day around her. She filed it, sat for a moment, then opened the next client file. Min-sik cooperated with federal investigators. She learned this from Deborah, who learned it from the FinCEN contact, who could share it only in the most general and unofficial terms. The cooperation was comprehensive. It had been, apparently, a very detailed cooperation, the kind that produces charges and sentencing recommendations, and the quiet dismantling of financial structures that had taken years to build. She thought about Min-sik, who was genuinely skilled at his work, who had applied that skill in service of something she found contemptible, who had in the end protected himself with exactly the tools she would have used: documentation, copies, evidence of everything. She thought about what that said about the work grit itself, the neutrality of numbers, the fact that a ledger doesn't care what it's recording. The thing that financial forensics valuable is the same thing that makes financial fraud possible. The money always tells the truth, even when the people moving it are lying. She didn't feel sorry for Min-sik. She felt, in a way she didn't fully examine, a kind of cold professional recognition. Han Jae-won was located in Vancouver 3 months later. The details didn't reach her, whatever happened. To him happened in the machinery of investigations and consequences she was no longer adjacent to. She didn't need to know. Duhwan remained in operation. She understood this. Men like Duhwan didn't disappear, they adapted, recalculated, found new geometries for the same fundamental enterprise. The federal investigation would take time. These things always took time. What she had done was not end anything. What she had done was shift the balance of exposure and cost significantly enough that the version of the situation that included her and Loretta and the foundation was no longer worth attacking. That was enough. It had to be enough, and she had made her peace with that distinction. Loretta died on a morning in late spring, 11 months after the night. She'd wandered out into the snow in one slipper. Not suddenly, not dramatically. The kind of dying that moves in stages, each stage a new accommodation, the body finding smaller and smaller rooms to live in until it found none. Imani was there in the final days, sleeping on the cot the facility kept for family members, reading aloud when Loretta's eyes were open and sitting in silence when they weren't. The last clear moment came 2 days before the end. Loretta's eyes opened and found Imani's face with the focused clarity that sometimes came back briefly near the close, like a signal gaining strength one final time before it went to static. Imani, she said. Her voice was thin, but the name was right, exact, unmistakably hers. I'm here, Grandma. I know. Loretta's hand found hers without looking. Are you okay? Imani opened her mouth, closed it. I'm getting there, she said. That's all anyone gets, Loretta said. Getting there. A pause long enough that Imani thought she'd slipped back. Then the accounting firm. It's good. It's growing. Good. Another pause. The man Grandma. Is he still there? Imani looked at the window. Spring outside, for the first time actual green on the trees in the courtyard, light that wasn't trying to qualify itself. Yes, she said. Good, Loretta said again, and then softly, in the direction of the ceiling, rather than at anyone in particular broken handle. She closed her eyes. She did not open them again with the same clarity. She died early on, a Thursday morning, with Imani's hand in hers, and the spring light coming through the south-facing windows she had always liked, and the facility's night staff moving quietly in the corridor outside, and the world going about its business in the indifferent and ordinary way it always did. Imani sat with her for a while after. Then she stood up, folded the cot blanket, straightened the items on the windowsill, the photograph of her mother, the ceramic mug with the broken handle. She did these things slowly and carefully, because Loretta had taught her that you finished what you started before you stopped for anything else. She picked up the mug last, held it for a moment. Then she put it in her bag to take home. The hidden ledger copied the one in the waterproof folder in the craft supplies box. She retrieved 3 weeks after Loretta's death. On the morning she helped clear the room. She held the folder for a moment in the empty room. The window still faced south. The shelf was bare. The decorative box that had held watercolors and dried-out markers and 30 pages of financial intelligence sat open on the bed, ready to be broken down for recycling. She put the folder in her bag. That afternoon she met with Mr. Lim and had the copy, formally and legally destroyed, documented destruction, witnessed with a certificate she filed in the same encrypted folder that held everything else. The encrypted folder itself she deleted the following day. Not because the danger was completely past. She understood enough to know it wasn't. A sound like green wood splitting, but because the moment had arrived when carrying it was weight than it was protection, and she had decided she was done carrying weight that had finished its purpose. The foundation continued. By the end of its first year, it had funded secured memory care access for 11 families who couldn't afford it. By the end of its second 23, the board expanded. Patricia remained. The retired physician recruited 2 additional board members from the healthcare community. The foundation developed a grant application process, a waiting list, a small administrative office. Imani stayed on as an informal financial advisor, which took approximately 4 hours per month and was the 4 hours she found most satisfying. The park bench was his suggestion. She'd said yes to one afternoon. The first time was unremarkable. They sat. They watched the water. He told her about a decision he was trying to make about one of the businesses under transition, and she told him her opinion, and he listened, and they sat in silence for a while after that. The second time he told her something she hadn't expected, that he had started attending a weekly language class. Japanese, not Korean, he already spoke. Korean and English, and Japanese had been on a list of things he'd meant to learn for 20 years and hadn't. He found it difficult. He found the difficulty interesting. She told him she'd learned enough Spanish in a community college night class to read menus and get directions, which had seemed like enough at the time. He asked if she'd ever wanted to travel. She said she'd spent so long managing crises that she'd forgotten how to want things that weren't immediately necessary. He was quiet for a while after that. Then he said, "What would you want if you let yourself want it?" She thought about it genuinely. Not the diplomatic answer. Not the careful answer. "A week somewhere warm," she said. "Somewhere I don't know anyone, and no one knows me. Somewhere the numbers I'm thinking about belong to a dinner bill, and nothing else. That's a reasonable thing to want. Most things I want are reasonable," she said. "I've never been the dramatic type." Something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Closer than he usually got, they sat. The water moved the way water always moved, constant, indifferent, going nowhere, going everywhere. A boat somewhere on the far side. The particular light of late afternoon on a city that had been cold for so long that warmth felt like a revelation every year, no matter how expected it was. She looked at his hands on the bench beside her. The watch she'd noticed 18 months ago in a hallway. The stillness that was habit, and the stillness that was actual rest, and the way she could tell the difference now. She thought about a woman crying on a floor outside a door. She thought about $1,100. A sound splitting. She thought about all the versions of herself that had gotten her to this bench, the girl in her grandmother's kitchen during thunderstorms, the student who'd found accounting because numbers behaved more consistently than people, the professional whose career had been taken from her in a parking lot on a Tuesday, the housekeeper who had learned to be invisible and had decided to stop. She looked at the water. She thought about what Loretta had said. Getting there. That's all anyone gets. Beside her on the bench, Tae-jun shifted slightly. His ribs had healed. The careful way he'd held himself for months was gone, and what was left was the ordinary way a person sits when their body isn't managing pain, which looked different than she'd expected, more relaxed. In small ways she wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't spent so long noticing the alternative. He didn't say anything. He had learned over months of park benches and nothing required of either of them, when silence was the right answer, and when it wasn't. This was the right answer. The afternoon light shifted. Somewhere behind them, a child's voice carrying over the not words, just sound, the particular pitch of a young person, doing something that required no thought at all. Running, probably. The freedom of running for no reason. She became aware of his hand near hers on the bench. Not touching. Just near. She looked at it. She thought about choice, about the specific quality of a choice made freely, without pressure, without the architecture of crisis forcing the decision. She had not had that in a long time, maybe ever, in the areas of her life that mattered most. She'd been choosing under constraint for so long that choosing freely felt like a different muscle one. She wasn't sure she'd developed yet. She was working on it. She looked out at the water. Then she placed her hand in his, not dramatically, not with the weight of everything it represented the 18 months, the warehouse, the cafe, the documents in some safe, the foundation, the bench, the slow accumulation of ordinary afternoons. None of that was in the gesture. The gesture was just a hand in a hand, which was also exactly what it was. He didn't move. He just let it be there. She had built a firm with her name on the door. She had cleared her name, not with a letter that meant nothing, but with work that meant something. She had protected Loretta from the worst of what age and disease could do, and had held her hand through the rest of it, and had taken home the mug with the broken handle that was sitting on her desk right now between a stapler and a coffee she'd let go cold. She had walked out of a building carrying nothing belonging to someone else and had built from nothing, something that was entirely her own. She had done that. Tae-jun had opened a door. She had walked through it and built a life on the other side. The water moved. The light changed. A bird crossed the open sky above the park and kept going, not stopping, certain of its direction, headed somewhere with the whole blank afternoon in front of it. Imani sat on the bench beside a complicated man in a city that had tried to make her invisible. She watched the water. She was not invisible. She never had been. She had just been waiting, mating, for the right moment, to make sure everyone else knew it too.